A common challenge of the competent but otherwise bored Factorio player is the construction of a megabase. Mega being a metric prefix signifying million, and base in reference to your factory. The objective of a megabase then is to make a factory which produces 1 million science per minute, which, what's that? It's usually 1,000 science per minute. Surely that's a kilo base. Well, that's not going to do. So in this trilogy of videos, I'm going to make a real, mega as in million, megabase. Beginning in this video with making a conventional 1000 science per minute kilo base of the star system to kick us off on the right foot. Since the Forge World aesthetic is just far too good to pass up on, I'm using the Any Planet Start mod to begin this run on the geoactive hellhole of Vulcanus. Almost immediately, I'm on fire, which is a good start. Since there are no resource patches for iron, copper or stone on Vulcanus, I have to mine rocks to get them, as well as a bit of bonus tungsten, which I can't mine from the patch until later on. I set up shop on this little coal patch, which I could barely see as it blends into the ashy flatlands near seamlessly. Unlike Nalvis, Vulcanus rocks don't drop any coal, so I'm forced to mine it by hand from the patch, like a peasant. Due to the Any Planet Start mod, I don't need to research steel, since it's required for us to get power in the first place before we can do any research. I've started producing it right away, not because I need it for anything specific in this moment, but because producing 50 of it unlocks the steel axe technology, which lets us mine faster. And when our only source of iron and copper is mining rocks right now, that's a significant upgrade. Before I can make any more progress, I'm going to need calcite, so I'm placing down a little burner mine setup on a nearby patch. Smelting 5 steel also unlocked solar panels, so I can use one to power this sulfuric acid pump jack, unlocking basic coal liquefaction, but before I can do anything with that, I'm going to need to do some research, so I place down a lab. That chemical plant is set to be incredibly powerful acid neutralization recipe, the cheap and plentiful steam of which will solve all of my power wars once I've researched steam power. Once that's done, I can place down some steam engines so we can use electricity not just during the day. I've also placed down an oil refinery to turn calcite, coal and sulfuric acid into heavy oil using that basic coal liquefaction recipe I mentioned earlier, which we need for lubricant to make this planet's unique building, the foundry. Foundries are excellent because they can process the plentiful lava surrounding us into an unlimited source of iron, copper and stone, as well as having a 50% productivity boost. Paired with the fact we can use foundries to craft more foundries, we now get a free foundry for every 2 foundries we make. To facilitate the continued crafting of these machines, I have a little hand-fed reinforced concrete build and a little tungsten carbide build, but the circuits I still need to craft by hand for the moment. Once a few foundries have crafted, I can place them down by this lava lake here to start putting some automation into my automation game, with a single foundry each turning lava into molten iron or copper. I'm going to hand feed the calcite for now, since by the time we're using enough to require a serious amount, I would hope I would have moved on to a bigger and better build. As in any good factory, my next step is automating iron gears and green circuits, before turning some of them into inserters and transport belts to help speed up construction and serve as ingredients for green science. I'm taking advantage of Foundry's ability to craft belts to get an extra 50% belts for the same amount of resources. The crash site is preventing the factory from growing, punishable by death. So I deconstruct it and put 60 science per minute of red and green science in its wake. It would be 60 science per minute of green science anyway, if I'd researched it yet. As we place more and more power-hungry foundries, the horrible steam power plant is slowly metastasizing, but it's temporary, so that's alright. More steam consumption stretched the single sulfuric acid geyser beyond its means, and the power's arse fell out, so I should probably get some more. Using the ability to disconnect power poles using the copper wire tool, I place these solar panels to just power some pump jacks and a single acid neutralisation plant, so that even if the main power grid fails, these will still make a trickle of steam. No point waiting around then, it's time to get straight into blue science. Engine units are super easy since we can produce limitless steel from nothing but a bit of calcite and lava. For some reason I turned iron plates into gears and pipes instead of directly casting them from molten iron, but in my defence I'm mostly used to making my blue science on Nalvis, where that isn't an option till quite late in the game. I'm then turning sulfuric acid into steam into water, and into heavy oil into light oil into petroleum, and then combining that into sulphur, which is so nearly cyclical it almost feels pointless, before making this quite large build just to support 2 plastic plants for the red circuits. Turning the plastic into red circuits, we are now producing blue science, which is where the game really starts to open up a lot. Because I breathe and have a pulse, I really want robots, which begins of course with electric engines. After a quick meander setting up more molten metal production and red ammo, I set up the very beginning of a mall and decide to go take on a demolisher. It goes, not unpredictably, very badly, with my bare minimum damage research pre-military science. Okay, so military science it is, which I've stuck on top of the other sciences like some sort of parasitic worm. I'm not quite as methodical with my placement this time, and utilising the even distribution mod, it's quite easy to distribute my old bag of ammo. The big lumbering coward is running away, so I pop a few rounds into his back and do a lot of definitely not running away back into the range of my turrets. It's looking pretty touch and go as he worms his way through my clump of turrets, but ultimately, the lead outside burns brighter than the tungsten within, and the lava leviathan falls. Clearly inebriated by this victory, I place down another clump of turrets in a territory to the north, just in waiting for the wormy to swing by and get his shit rocked. So, remember when I was meant to be making bots? Yeah, me neither. So I start setting up carbon for tungsten carbide, as simple as combining some of that coal we're mining with sulfuric acid. It's when I'm laying pipe for this that territory's worm meets our clump of turrets and wins decisively. I was worried for a moment that the fucker was going to come straight over here and start ripping into my base, which would have led to a thoroughly defenestrated computer, but fortunately he goes back to his business. Anyway, so if I combine that carbon with tungsten and yet more sulfuric acid, I've got tungsten carbide fully automated. I then automate refined concrete, which allows me to now fully automate foundries. And if I drag those electric engines and some red circuits over here, I can also automate big mining drills. That worm territory is genuinely in the way of my continued expansion, so I try again to kill the thing, and yet again, fail. Third tries the charm, however, and I managed to eliminate it without even losing that many turrets. Immediately I set up belt automation in its old home, as well as automated steam engines since my power grid is struggling. After setting up a new, much higher capacity steam production area, I begin my first massive array of steam engines. The steam created in the chemical plants is 500 degrees Celsius, whereas the maximum the steam engines can efficiently use is 165 degrees, meaning we're wasting a lot of the energy stored in that steam. Steam turbines would be much more effective, but we can't unlock those until we either go to Glaber and mine a copper stromatolite, or Nalvis and mine uranium, so we're stuck with the engines for now. Now that power is a bit less of a problem, I can start producing the upgraded red belts, with double the throughput of those crappy yellow belts. Also, I remembered I needed circuits for these splitters, so you can stop shouting at the screen now. At this point, I'm hunting worms for sport. I actually completely forgot to show myself building this tungsten mine before, so here's me expanding it a bit. It's from the territory of that first worm that I killed. Daily reminder to check that you're limiting your chests. At least it's basically free, thanks to coming from lava. Remember when I said I was setting up bots? Yeah, I'm actually doing it this time, starting with batteries. Batteries are stupidly easy on this planet, since most of the effort is from making the sulfuric acid, and copper and iron are basically free here. For the pedants, yes, metals aren't technically free, they cost calcite, but I can tell you from my hindsight writing this script later on, that even 50 hours into the run, I'm only on my second calcite patch, and this planet gets pretty fucking big. Once the batteries and electric engines are done, completing the flying robot frames is easy. I place the assemblers for construction and logistics bots, feeding into a chest which feeds into a robot part, for which I use a circuit condition to only fill the network up to a certain level of each, and just like that, the game has opened up. My first step is of course getting some modular armour with robot parts. Due to the short day-night cycle of Vulcanus, combined with its massive solar power boost, portable solar panels are very powerful. With an army of bots behind me, it's time to get some real work done, starting with this build which makes a full red belt of green circuits from just the molten metals. Then, just to be safe, I made another one. Before I move on to red circuits, I want the better core liquefaction recipe, unlocked using this planet's science pack. That starts with making tungsten plate from a combination of tungsten ore and molten iron. Then, combining that with tungsten carbide and molten copper in a foundry gets us the metallurgical science pack, and after routing that messily into the labs, I can start to research the real core liquefaction recipe. Core liquefaction requires some heavy oil to kickstart, so I have to use a simple recipe I had before to get that, but then by combining the heavy oil with coal and steam, I get all three primary oils, with some of the heavy oil then needing to be looped back into the start of the process. Once the process starts, it's going to very quickly clog up with the heavy oil which it mainly produces, so I have to use oil cracking to turn it into light oil, and any excess light oil into petroleum, which is mainly what we want. Unlike with advanced oil processing from Nalvis, where you need a lot more light oil cracking than heavy oil, it's almost the other way around with core liquefaction. Oil cracking costs a lot of water, which we can only get from condensing steam, so I put alarms on the steam and sulfuric acid tanks to warn me if I'm over-consuming and need to set up more production. With this new better oil setup, I can now start producing a massive amount of plastic, along with a bit of sulphur, which I turn into explosives and then the cliff explosives, which I have just finished researching. Most of that plastic goes into red circuits, which thanks to the ridiculous 1:24 ratio of copper wire foundry to red circuit assembler, is quite literally too big to fit on the screen all at once. To make my life easier fighting demolishers and getting to other planets with more damage upgrades, and also admittedly because I'd forgotten robot logistics had been moved to space science, I start to set up yellow science. Obviously, we already have the flying robot frames needed, but before I can set up any of the other ingredients, that steam alarm I set up goes off. Shit. Checking the chemical plants, it turns out it's because of a lack of sulfuric acid, so I run over to tap the last, 2 geysers on the starter acid patch. That's going to do about as much good as a fire extinguisher in a blast furnace, so I think it's time to go out and find a new patch. I do end up finding one out in the boonies, but it's halfway into a demolisher territory, so I lay down my bear trap, along with my bait in the form of a nice tasty mining outpost. The greedy bastard never stood a chance. With my steam supply freshly renewed, I set up blue circuits in low density structure, the last 2 ingredients for yellow science. LDS has a nice recipe in the foundry which is made from the 2 molten metals and plastic, and of course benefits from the productivity bonus of the foundry. It's only now I realise that it's space science I want for robot logistics, prompting me to set up rocket fuel and route overflow blue circuits and LDS over to the north here, where I'm planning my rocket silo array. I placed down the first silo over here with no productivity modules, totally because I'm cool and quirky and ungovernable, and not because I forgot. The threat of actually producing something, however, caused my piddly little starter coal patch to shrivel up like a grape in the sun. So before I can get into the fun, spacey bit of Space Age, I have to go stomp some more worms. I find a coal patch in another territory a bit further out than the one I just cleared, but it's so far from spawn that it's inhabited by a medium demolisher, and the stomper swiftly becomes the stompee, as my turrets quickly run out of ammo. Whilst I wait for more ammo to produce, I decided to set up Space Platform Foundation automation, since that doesn't use up any of our precious coal. When it comes to naming the space platforms, I'm incredibly unoriginal, so I'm going with cars again. This time, I'm starting with the Suzuki Alto. Alto meaning keep upright, so take that as you will. I plan out my initial space science production basically immediately, which even this little thing can support up to 60 science per minute, but with only a single silo, it's probably going to take a while to build. In case you don't know how space science works, or space in general in Space Age, the gist is that those asteroid collectors around the outside of a platform collect any little asteroid chunks flying past, which are deposited on the sushi belt, and those inserters on the top throw overboard any chunks that we have too much of. Then, the crushers turn the metallic, carbonic and oxide asteroids into iron ore, carbon and ice respectively, the iron ore needing to be smelted into plates to give us the 3 ingredients we need for space science. Whilst that platform very slowly builds, I have unfinished, wormy business far to the northeast. The worm seems to be far off on the other side of the territory, so I place down this mining drill, which I kind of assume attracts them. In the end, however, I go to find it myself and find him very happily minding his own business and not caring about the drill on his property. He does care about the bullets, however. To begin with, I wasn't sure if even this was enough, but it does do the job with scarily few turrets left. That worm did stand a chance. By now, Suzuki Keep Upright Alto is producing space science at full pelt. I did, however, forget to filter the input on the furnace to just take iron ore, so it can accidentally smelt steel, which I don't notice for a while. Here's where the coal comes in from those coal mines I forgot to record building, ready to be connected up when the current coal supply completely dries up. I, for some reason, put the landing pad on the complete opposite end of the factory from the labs, but the logistics of that is a later me problem, as I'm just moving it in bulk by hand until I get the few key researches I want. I'm in the middle of setting up purple science then, when I realise that rather than fit the square peg of 8+ science packs into the round hole of my tiny little 6 science lab setup by some sort of unearthly belt weaving abomination, I should instead just rip off a band-aid now and move on to a proper sushi science setup. So I do. Mostly, anyway. I don't actually have any footage of the completed build anywhere near this point in time. It was kind of set and forget. Professional video creator, people. Unlike a functional Factorio player, the only thing I pave in my factory is the bot mall. I don't really know why. Given this fact, it should be obvious what I'm building here. Of course, the first thing I automate is the tools to make more bot mall, and soon enough it's massive, ready to be filled with all the multitude of machines I'm going to need in my taking over of the star system. I'm at roughly the limit of what I can accomplish just sat here on Vulcanus, so it's about time I send up another space platform to make the traversal to another planet. This time, we're naming it Citron C1. I'm giving Citron C1 a pretty large cargo capacity, because my general plan to save time on the other planets is to just ship all the rocket ingredients and non-specific buildings from Vulcanus, ferrying it around on a big, fast space platform. I start off with my iron ore smelting, and I'm opting for foundries because it more than doubles the iron plates per ore we get, at only the cost of a bit of calcite which we can ship up from Vulcanus in bulk anyway. In retrospect, I definitely might have been going a bit overboard with the foundries. I could have survived on half this much. Feeding off the excess of foundries is an excess of magazine assemblers, and then of course this thing needs to move, so I get some engines set up. The biggest factor affecting speed is weirdly the width of the platform, so if you want your platform to be as fast as possible, you need to have as many engines as you can physically fit into a space the same size as the platform's widest point. This is why engine stacking is so effective, because you get more engines without adding the added width which usually comes with that. Engines need fuel and oxidizer to function, which are made by combining carbon or iron ore respectively with water. I settled for this design for asteroid crushing, which, full disclosure, is really, truly a terrible design which I regretted and botch solved with circuit conditions for a long time. This is because when crushing asteroids you get a small chance to get the asteroid itself back, which you should route back into the start of a process with priority so that it doesn't back up. But since I forgot to do this initially, my idea instead was to just try to pass the overflow between the two machines, with circuits to ensure that the new asteroid chunks aren't put into the system if the overflow hasn't been cleared. The problem is that there are just far too many edge cases in which this can back up. Plus, if the two sides are asymmetrically pulling resources, then it very easily backs up. Moral of the story, go with the simpler option and just route it back into the input. Okay, so whilst my poor space program slowly puts that platform together, it's time I aim my sights back down to Earth, Vulcanus. All this rocket production has strained my oil production massively, so I'm planning to extend my coal liquefaction to an industrial scale. I end up with this pretty little module, which after supplying with one of those lines of coal I brought in, and a few barrels of heavy oil from the old setup to kickstart it, brings our oil production back to satisfactory levels. The long-handed inserters we are using can't actually move enough coal to keep up with maximum production, however, which I was going to first fix by using quality modules to gamble into possession of a few rare long-handed inserters, dumping the rest into lava, but ultimately decide to just cram another belt down the other side of the refineries, which makes the build not quite as satisfying. And, of course, I can't forget oil cracking. Back on Citroen C1, I began construction of the, as I affectionately named it, Solar 5 head. Solar around Vulcanus, and our first planet of interest, is good enough that it probably didn't need to be as big as it is, but I have plans for this space later on, which necessitates a bit of wiggle room. Right at the very front of the platform, I made an asteroid sorting loop which takes in chunks from the asteroid collectors, and either drops them off onto a belt towards their respective crushers, or if there's too much of a given chunk type, sets its reprocessing recipe in these crushers to turn it into another type of asteroid we might not have as many of. Soon enough it's collected enough stray asteroids to get a bit of fuel in the engines, so to get the buffers filled and the ammo and fuel manufacturing running at full pelt, we're going to have to start moving. One of the quirks of using the Any Planet Start mod is that your home planet never has medium asteroids around it, which inadvertently made building Citroen C1 easier than it should have been, but also, as just stated, made it quite a bit harder to get started up properly. By the time we're on the return trip, however, the platform is no longer starving and has made it up to a respectable speed of over 200 km per second. That wasn't with full buffers, however, and by its third trip, which I seem to have spent the entirety of debugging that god-awful crusher setup, it's cruising comfortably at 270 km per second, which is fast enough to get from planet to planet in under a minute. Now that we know it's functional, I get the platform loaded up with supplies, and myself, and jet off to the first planet I'm going to visit, which if you were paying attention to the travel progress bar when I was test flying, you will know is now Vise. I touch down in the middle of a massive desert, and I am here for one very specific purpose: gathering uranium. Getting nuclear power now will make travelling to Fulgora, and working on Glaber, far easier, and will also likely be necessary for flying to the final planet Aquilo later on. Also, more importantly, I'm going to want to use biolabs as soon as I unlock them, so I'm killing two birds with one stone by setting down my foothold now. The first thing I do is place down some iron and copper production and a field of solar panels so that I can craft a car to explore with, since I forgot to bring one with me. To the northeast I find an oil patch which I'll need for making sulfuric acid to mine the uranium, and to the northwest I find the patch itself which has a modest 1.5 million ore, effectively over 3 million due to the resource drain multiplier of big mining drills, halving how much it takes for the same amount of ore. Once it's connected up to power, the act of mining a uranium ore researches uranium processing for us, and I immediately queue all of the uranium related researches that unlocks. I also enclose my mines with flamethrowers to deter any mega insectoid investigators. I've replaced the electric furnaces with foundries relying on calcite imported from Vulcanus, because I want the ore patch to last as long as possible, and using centrifuges also imported from Vulcanus, I can start processing the uranium, hoping to get the 40 uranium-235 required to kickstart the Corvarex enrichment process. Back on Vulcanus for a second, that core liquefaction build still wasn't quite enough to keep up with demand, so I doubled it up and began to reach roboports out towards the coal patch so I can remotely build more mines. Whilst on one hand I build out my primary perimeter on Nauvis, I build roboports along the coal belts on Vulcanus, swapping back and forth and planning one whilst I wait for the other to build. My supply of uranium-235 is closing in on the required 40, so I place down the centrifuges. I'm just going for a dumb design, which doesn't try to limit the number of 235 in the machine to a bare minimum of 40, so it'll take a bit longer than it perhaps should to start up, but once the buffers have filled up it'll be just as fast as any other Corvarex setup. I'm not going to produce any rocket ingredients on this planet, instead just importing them from Vulcanus, since the only thing I'll actually be sending up is the occasional pod of fuel cells for now. On Vulcanus, my vast roboport appendage has reached the coal patch, and I print down some more miners on a twin patch right next to it. Once the coal arrives, that's our oil shortage solved. Again. Until it's not. Again. Up on Citron C1, I'm doing that work on the Solar 5 head which I alluded to, beginning with hollowing it out. Ignore the fact that I placed the ammo belt backwards, I fix that later. Then, maybe predictably, I placed down 2 nuclear reactors into the gap. The fact is, it was never intended to be a solar ship. I just needed the panels until I reached Nauvis and started mining uranium. Because I forgot to actually make a route through the foundries for fuel cells, I ended up having them share a belt with calcite for a bit, and then split off and spaghetti through to the reactors. Despite it being slightly overkill, which has never stopped me before, I intend to make the full 160 megawatts of peak power available, which needs 16 heat exchangers and 28 steam turbines. Just as soon as it's been over to Nauvis to collect some fuel cells, I build the last of the steam turbines over some more solar panels, and with that, Citron C1 is ready for any inner star system challenge we can throw at it, including the cold, sandy, and solar challenged planet of Fulgora, whose door we are darkening next. It's to my immense disappointment to realise after landing that I haven't sent a landing pad with me on Citron C1, so whilst I send the platform back to grab one, I'm going to stay decently close to my initial landing site, since I'll need to trek back to get it once it's been sent down. Quite fortunately though, I found a Fulgoran vault ruin literally right next to my spawn island, so I can mine that to get the recycler research right away. During my exploration, I find this pretty huge island not too far to the northwest, so I decide that this can be the location of my Fulgoran base, once I've been back to collect the landing pad, of course. After I've set down the pad and given it the right logistics requests, my platform will automatically dump down everything we need to put the base together, including substations, accumulators, the ingredients to craft a rocket silo, big mining drills, and some belts to kickstart my initial scrap recycling setup. Recycling scrap gives us one of these items randomly, which themselves can be recycled into 25% of their ingredients. Everything I build on Fulgara has to be within range of one of these lightning collectors, which not only protects my buildings from being struck by lightning, but also discharges the lightning's power into the grid where it can be stored in the accumulators. For now, I just have this temporary setup for scrap sorting where the resources get dumped into a loop and pulled off by inserters into provider chests. And of course the first thing I automate is more recyclers. In my initial playthrough of Space Age, I did try to use belts on Fulgara, but with the dozens of different items we'll soon be drowning in, and the near infinite scalability of bots once we get to infinite speed researches and quality robo parts, bots should be more than enough until we reach the Megabase stage later on. Once I've placed so many recyclers that my little loop is struggling to keep up, I begin the process of producing holmium, this planet's unique resource. Melting ice and then combining the water with stone and holmium ore gives us holmium solution, and then passing that into an assembly machine, or preferably a foundry, gives us holmium plates. The 50% productivity from foundries makes such a difference in early Fulgara that I'd almost call visiting Vulcanus a prerequisite for visiting Fulgara. And with that on top of something I'll talk about when we get to Glaber later, I'd almost be tempted to call Vulcanus, then Fulgara, then Glaber the canonical order to visit the 3 first planets in. The next step in my conquering of Fulgara is to start dealing with waste products. This can be done really easily using bots. We just make all these requester chests feeding onto belts into an array of recyclers, and set the requests of the chests based on any items in the network which we have more than a certain threshold of, in this case 2000. I then feed the products of this recycling into active provider chests, meaning bots will automatically come to take them into central storage, where the products themselves will then be subject to the threshold. Meanwhile, I set up refined concrete production, visible next to the landing pad there, and a much larger holmium solution production. I had OBS paused when I built my first electromagnetic plant, this planet's version of the foundry, which makes electronics with a 50% productivity boost, but you can see 2 there making accumulators and more EM plants. I placed a tank and a pump before the holmium plate foundry because holmium solution is used a lot in this planet's science pack, and I don't want the science to be starved by just making loads of plates for other stuff. The first step in this planet's science pack is combining light oil, to craft which we pump up heavy oil from the oil sands between islands and crack with water, along with holmium, plastic and copper to make superconductor. We also need to make electrolyte by combining heavy oil, holmium solution and stone. Combining the electrolyte with green circuits, batteries, superconductor and holmium plate then gets us supercapacitors. Because my stupid skull has the attention span of a goldfish, I just need to quickly divert to note that I've set up green belts on Vulcanus in the middle of all this, which are a whole 4 times faster than yellow belts, by combining blue belts with tungsten plate and more lubricant. Anyway, as we were, combining supercapacitors with accumulators, electrolyte and holmium solution gives us the electromagnetic science pack. In preparation for launching rockets to get this EM science back home, I set up rocket fuel. Blue circuits and LDS already come from scrap, so I don't need to worry about producing those. We will have more than enough. By now, I've got enough logistic spots imported from Vulcanus that I can just start dumping scrap recycling products straight into active provider chests and then letting the bot network sort them. Speaking of Vulcanus, I've set up a requester chest at the Sushi Science setup to place the new EM Science packs onto the belt, as well as adding the request in the landing pad and extending it with a few cargo bays, which not only increase its inventory size but also increase the speed at which pods can be dropped to the planet. The tiny scrap patch I started with is very quickly dwindling, so my next step is to use elevated rails to connect up to a larger scrap patch on another island. During the process I got killed by lightning, which I was most displeased about. I eventually arrived at this island, which you might recognise as the one I mined the vault ruin off. It has a patch containing a whopping 25 million scrap, a number so large that even if we were draining a flat 4 green belts of scrap off it, using big mining drills, it would still last 60 hours before any quality or productivity. This will do nicely. This is how it looks in the end. I know that I missed some efficiency modules out of those miners, and I would promise that I fix it later, but I quite literally never come back to this island, so I won't. I attached the input from this mine onto the existing belt of scrap, with priority for the old mine so that I can get rid of it quicker. You'll notice that I've graduated to using green belts. Not long after this, the first EM science arrives back on Vulcanus so that we can start researching lightning collectors, which I don't end up using for another 30 hours. Sometimes that's just how it goes. Next after that is quality module 3, since I've decided to start a quality farm here on Fulgora. The idea is simple. We have one building for each quality tier, put quality modules in each, and recycle any overflow with quality modules before routing the output back into the start of a process. It's not fast, but it is effective, and I'm setting it up now so that when I really need good quality modules next video, TM, I've hopefully accumulated enough. I then copy this setup for quality 2 modules. Those combinators just check how much of each quality tier of item is in the chest, and if there's more than 50 of one, it feeds those to the recyclers. With me having done everything I need to do right now on Fulgora, it's about time we head to everyone's favourite planet, Glaber. My first act on this planet is of violence, as I destroy this little pentapod egg raft just to the south of my landing site. The pentapod eggs it drops are essential for crafting this planet's unique building, but spoil after 15 minutes into a live pentapod. Spoilage is the main mechanic on this planet, which makes it my most frustrating, but still favourite, planet, as all biological items have a spoilage timer from when they are made, which after it reaches 0 they turn into another item, usually spoilage. Up north I slay some more egg rafts, but also find some Yumiko trees, the first of the 2 important fruits this planet holds. Just like on Fulgora and Nalvis, the first thing I want to do is set down a landing pad, and set the logistics requests for Citron C1 to send down all the materials I'll need to get started. Then, after mining the other important fruit, Jelly Nut, I unlock this planet's unique building, the Biochamber, which is crafted using iron, green circuits, landfill, nutrients, and pentapod eggs. The nutrients can be made from spoilage or later on fruits, but pentapod eggs can only be acquired from killing pentapod nests and breeding the eggs in a biochamber. Quick side note, here's me setting up quality 3 modules on Fulgora. Each tier 3 module now takes a special item from a specific planet, and for quality, it's Superconductor from Fulgora. Back on Glaber, I'm using the biochamber to start processing Yumiko, which gives us 2 Yumiko mash each and a 2% chance of a seed. Since each plant you mine gives you 50 fruit, processing fruit by hand gives you on average the exact number of seeds you need to maintain production, assuming you process all fruits before they rot. But thanks to a 50% productivity bonus from biochambers, I actually get more seeds than I use, and so in theory can grow my harvest over time. You might notice that instead of electricity, biochambers are powered by consuming nutrients, which although rather annoying means that Glaber bases need very little electricity. Whilst out exploring, I ran headfirst into a pretty big pentapod nest, which ended predictably.
Oh my god. I love my life so much.
For those unfamiliar with the fauna of Glaber, the biggest creatures are stompers, which rely on stomping. The medium ones are strafers, which kind of run around you in a circle and shoot little wriggler projectiles at you. And the smallest ones are wrigglers, which are basically just reskinned biters with a bit more health. When I returned, most of the pentapods had moved back to their nest, and the one strafer that remained was quite easily dispatched with my machine gun. Back at base, I'm trying to do some bootleg egg breeding so that I can make enough biochambers to make a proper base. Eggs need 60 nutrients and some water to reproduce, which can only practically be fed by first processing jelly nut into jelly and Yumiko into mash, before combining that into bioflux, which can be turned into a lot of nutrients we can use to feed the egg breeding. Despite production not needing a lot of electricity, I'm going to have something else which will need a lot, so I'm printing down a nuclear reactor here on Glaber, which I'll just feed from Citron C1's fuel cell supply. The only resource patches on Glaber are stone, which is pretty useful because we're going to need a lot of landfill, so I set to work turning this entire patch into just landfill. It's time now to get into farming, so that I can start my real Glaber base. It's as simple as placing this agricultural tower near a patch of fertile soil, best identified by the fact it will already have fruit trees growing on it, and will be coloured a vibrant purple or green on the map, depending on which fruit it is you're trying to grow. All it needs is an input for seeds and output for fruit, and as long as it's powered it will automatically plant and harvest fruit trees on suitable ground around it. You can see that I'm just using red belts for sending seeds to the farms, since they don't spoil, but green belts for taking the fruits back from the farms, so that they spoil as little as possible before reaching the biochambers. Farming isn't all sunshine and daisies, however, as every time a fruit is harvested, it releases spores into the atmosphere, which, if they spread to a pentapod nest, will cause them to attack. It's essentially like pollution on Nalvis for biters. Thankfully though, these Tesla turrets we unlocked from Fulgora are pretty overpowered against pentapods, for reasons I'll explain when we see them in action later. They also take a whopping 1 megawatt of power just to idle, which is why we needed the nuclear power plant. This many might be a bit, get your bingo cards ready, overkill, but it's given me the confidence to put down the agricultural tower and actually start up our farming. The tower starts out clearing its area of random trees which aren't for fruit, so I stand here hoovering up the spoilage and wood that produces. But once the area is sufficiently clear, fruit starts to flow on the belt. I start up jelly nut just the same, and now I can set up the fruit processing in a central area. There are a few considerations with fruit processing, since I need 3 different outputs for the processed fruit, the seeds, and for spoilage, for anything that spoils whilst in the machine. Then when combining it into bioflux, I again need to account for any spoilage that needs pulling out. The nutrients for this base will be provided from bioflux, and carried around on a half of this belt, the other half reserved for spoilage, since anything which takes in nutrients will eventually produce spoilage. At the end of the fruit and nutrient/spoilage belts, I place down these heating towers which burn anything we throw into them. This not only destroys spoilage, but also stops highly rotten fruit from backing up on the belt, since most of the time the spoilage progress of ingredients is carried over to the products. Next up, I'm setting up my egg breeding, for which I'm using this little chest loop which is constantly breeding new eggs, so the old ones don't spoil and spawn pentapods. I don't have to worry about them backing up because I'll be constantly either using them up crafting agricultural science by combining them with bioflux, or burning them if I'm producing more than the science can consume. Agricultural science spoils just like everything else biological, so I don't need to worry about it backing up anyway, and most eggs will go into crafting that. I did make some poor design decisions which led to these horrible bioflux and nutrient belt shenanigans at the top, as well as me having to mix agricultural science onto the burn belt, and then separate it back out before it reaches the heating towers. I also placed biochamber production just off the burn belt, so that excess eggs that get sent away can be turned into biochambers instead of being destroyed. And to prevent eggs spoiling in the machine if backed up, I only input them when there are less than a set threshold of biochambers in the chest. Despite the main factory producing 0 spores and therefore not being a real target for the pentapods, I still place some Tesla turrets around the place in case either some eggs inadvertently hatch or an attack party paths through the base towards the farm they want to attack. I've finished research on something pretty cool which I'm forced to craft on Fulgora and then have Citron C1 express deliver to me. Whilst we wait for that, I'm combining Umicore seeds, nutrients and landfill to make artificial Umicore soil, which allows us to expand the growable area around the agricultural towers by placing it over the biome's fertile water. The same can be done with jelly nut. Very late game, we can also unlock overgrowth soil, which lets us plant Umicore and jelly nut anywhere in the green or purple biomes respectively. Back on Vulcanus, I set up a chest ready to accept agricultural science, just as soon as we start launching it, as well as a heating tower to burn any spoilage it produces. On Citron C1's next flyover of Glaber, it drops off materials to craft a rocket silo, as well as mech armour, which is that pretty cool thing I spoke about earlier. Not only does it have this humongous equipment grid, but also lets me fly over stuff. Very nice, and means I'm unlikely to be dying from any more pentapods, as my escape is far easier. I also now have a portable fission reactor instead of solar panels, so suit power is pretty much sorted going forward. I decide to dump bioflux into a provider chest along with the agri-science, because we're going to need to start exporting it to Nalvis eventually. The silo itself is going just above the incoming fruit belts. In retrospect, it probably would have been better to put it right next to the provider chests to reduce loading times for the limited bot network, but it's not the end of the world. Back on Vulcanus, I'm switching entirely to steam turbines, which make more efficient use of the 500 degree steam, meaning that the effective power output of those acid neutralization plants is more than triple. After another pass from Citron C1, I get a second rocket silo built. I also changed my colour to purple, because the default browny orange colour is really boring. Something I neglected to do earlier was deal with overflow seeds, since with biochamber productivity we make 50% more seeds than we use. These would eventually back up, so I use a priority splitter to pull any overflow off the belt and feed it into a heating tower. My work on Glaber being essentially done, I jetted back up to Citron C1 to head to Fulgora. I decide to expand my quality module production whilst I'm here, including making quality red and blue circuit production. Despite Fulgora being arguably the home of quality, with the tier 3 module and recyclers being unlocked here, I can't help but think that due to most components coming already assembled, that it's not really suitable for my legendary factory in the future. I realised that I forgot to set up carbon fibre on Glaber before I left, so I do that now. It first requires carbon, which we can make in a biochamber using just spoilage as an ingredient. And then if we combine that with Umicore mash, we get carbon fibre. It's used in some important items later, as well as the new rocket turret I've researched with agricultural science. Rocket turrets are going to be important in the new space platform I've just sent up, Citron DS3. As you can see, I've saved no expense on the cargo hold on this thing. I really don't want to have to design a new Aquilo transfer ship for a long time. Just like Citron C1, it's going to be entirely nuclear powered, since as far out as Aquilo, solar has absolutely no chance at powering a decent size and speed ship. Whilst I wait for resources to accumulate to build DS3, I get back over to Glaber and expand the farms, since I don't seem to have built enough the first time around. I didn't just come here for that though, I also wanted to set up artillery so that this base isn't susceptible to enemy expansions if we leave it working for a prolonged period of time. I manually target some nearby egg rafts outside of automatic targeting range, mostly because I want to really see the Tesla turrets in action. They do not disappoint, although this is a pretty small attack wave. I wonder how it would do against a slightly larger one. Well, lucky for you, I bit off what I thought in the moment was massively more than I could chew. This really could end up badly, because I'm counting at least 5 stompers there. My radars catch the swarm sneaking around the lake, closing in on the jelly nut farm where the artillery shots originated from. The thing that makes Tesla turrets so overpowered against pentapods is that it hits their head and each leg individually with its chained electricity, essentially meaning it does 6 times more damage to pentapods than regular enemies. That, along with the stun it causes which slows down the target, means they manage to handle the big swarm whilst taking minimal damage. You see, that's what I meant earlier when I said there was a canonical order to visit the planets. Because foundries from Vulcanus trivialise Homium production on Fulgora, and Tesla turrets from Fulgora trivialise defence on Glaber. It just rhymes. On Nalvis I'm combining flying robot frames, steel, blue circuits and bioflux, all imported of course, to make capture rockets. A new type of ammo I just unlocked which I can fire at a nest to do this. Man-made horrors beyond our comprehension. That's right, we've captured a live biter spawner, and are now stealing biter eggs for our own nefarious purposes. Captive spawners consume 1 bioflux every minute, and if we don't provide this they start to take damage until they eventually break free and turn into a normal biter spawner. Our first nefarious purpose for biter eggs is to grow biolabs, massive clumps of mutated neural structure contained in a machine which can research with twice the efficiency of conventional labs. Basically, every technology costs half as many research packs if you're using biolabs. Biolabs do have 3 issues however. For the first 2, they use a lot of power, and they produce a lot of pollution. And with the high tier productivity modules we'll be putting into them, this issue will only be amplified. The third, and even worse one however, is the fact that with the biological component of the biolabs coming from Nalvis, it can only survive there, so if we want to make use of this boost, all produced science will need to be shipped to Nalvis. To remedy the first 2, I've added a nuclear power plant to solve the power issue, and Tesla turrets around the perimeter to help defend against encroaching roaches drawn in by the massive pollution cloud. Over on Vulcanus, I'm working on moving all of the science into provider chests so that it can be launched up to Citron C1 and over to Nalvis. It's a temporary solution. I think in the very final base I'll be forced to make every science I can on Nalvis for UPS and logistical reasons. I've also turned that captive nest into a productivity module free factory, since biter eggs are productivity module's special item. Eggs don't spoil whilst still in nests, so I just have a circuit that only inserts a single egg when all the other ingredients are present, to stop any getting stuck in the buffer and spoiling into live biters. Once the first few loads of science have arrived, research begins on the atomic bomb. I do try a bit of nest fighting without it, just using a handheld Tesla gun, but it takes forever just to kill one village. Once I get bored of killing nests the slow way, I start designing Citron DS3's production system, and get so caught up in it, I miss atomic bombs getting researched. For now. From Glaber, I got the Advanced Asteroid Processing recipe, which gives me improved thruster fuel recipes, so I don't need a ridiculous number of chemical plants solely dedicated to fuel and oxidizer production. The improved recipes require calcite, but rather than importing it all from Vulcanus, I can now get it from oxide asteroids using advanced oxide processing, along with a bit less ice than the normal recipe. There are advanced versions of both metallic and carbonic too. Metallic giving copper, which won't be useful just yet, but carbonic giving sulfur, which you will soon see is very important for reaching a Quilo. Moving up from fuel production, I start on ammo production. I would recommend strongly against replicating anything you see me do on this platform. It's clunky, it's messy, and most of it didn't even work in this initial iteration. Like I was talking about a moment ago, sulfur is really important because we can combine it with carbon and water to make coal, and then combine that with more sulfur and more water to make explosives, which we need to make rockets, which are the only thing that can break up the big asteroids that we'll encounter on the way to Aquilo. For asteroid collection and reprocessing right at the front of the ship, I've copied the setup from Citroen C1, just with some added rocket turrets. On Citroen C1, I had walls on either side instead of defences, leading to a dozen or so destroyed warnings an hour as it catches stray asteroids. But on this ship, I'm forced to defend the sides because a little wall won't help against getting broadsided by a big asteroid. Of course, that's just half the ship, but I can copy and mirror the entire thing over to make it whole. Whilst I was waiting for that to build, I suddenly remembered that I have nukes now, so I go on a rampage to clear out biter nests so that our biolab's pollution doesn't lead us to an untenable defensive situation. Even once DS3's construction is complete, it takes an ungodly amount of resources to fill the buffers to the point this Colossus can even move, which means even more waiting. It's so bad, I'm shipping ice from Fulgora on Citroen C1 and then sending it down to Vulcanus to be shipped up to get enough water into the fuel and reactor. With the bit of fuel this provides, I limp out of Vulcanus orbit towards Glaber, since interplanetary space contains far more resources to fill the buffers faster. Despite this, I soon find DS3 beached like a whale in space, slowly being pulled back towards Vulcanus and not much better off than it began. When it rains, it pours, however, and soon the great hulking platform has snowballed up to a decent speed, only increasing and with absolutely no defensive concerns to be heard of. And then, just as I'm getting confident in it and go AFK, it does this. As it turns out, I had neglected in multiple places to deal with the asteroid chunks that processing spits out, so in this instance my iron plate, and therefore ammo production, was blocked with metallic asteroid chunks, and so I had to make this ugly inserter chain to throw them overboard. The best way to really test how well it will work is a trial by fire, so I send it straight off to Aquilo with me, all the items I need to get started, and very little faith in this platform's ability to keep me safe. Amazingly though, considering this is the first try, it's handling the asteroids really well, and is faster than the Aquilo ship I had in my original Space Age series. It soon drifts into orbit of the icy planet of Aquilo, and I can eject down to the surface to face the final, and most difficult of Space Age's 5 planets. Aquilo is covered in a sea of liquid ammonia, with only the occasional iceberg floating on its planet-spanning ocean. Mining these icy formations on the surface, I get ice platforms, which act as a landfill for this planet specifically, and lithium, which is this planet's unique resource and is important for a lot of endgame stuff. Most buildings cannot be built directly onto ice, needing some sort of insulator so that their heat doesn't melt it. So I place concrete down for me to place the landing pad on top of. Once my supplies have been sent down, I immediately place a nuclear reactor next to the landing pad. Nothing can function on Aquilo without external heat, so nuclear reactors and heating towers are essential in keeping any industry we have forward. I also brought solar panels? This might seem like an incredibly silly idea, with solar on Aquilo being 1% as effective as on Nalvis. But to use any other form of power, we need to first melt the ice into water, which, with each solar panel outputting only 600 watts, not kilowatts, watts of energy, it's a taller order than you might think. I prepare a power plant regardless, which due to even the turbines and 500-degree steam pipes needing heating for some reason, I need to design quite strangely to fit in the heat pipes. Forgetting I had some ice in my inventory already from mining the formations, I placed down a chemical plant to separate out the ammoniacal solution from the ocean into ammonia and ice. The ammonia will be important later. I'm then of course melting the ice in a chemical plant into water to feed into the heat exchangers. A few efficiency modules make it a bit less unbearably long, and once the first ice has been melted, I just need to wait until the reactor gets up to temperature so it can be boiled into steam. Whilst I wait for that to happen, I start spitballing a setup to separate ammoniacal solution into ammonia and ice, and then recombine without most of the ammonia to make ice platforms so we can expand our buildable area. We can combine the excess ammonia that's being pulled out with some of the crude oil which can also be found on Aquilo to make solid fuel, which by feeding into heating towers we can use to keep the whole build warm. Once it's up and running, that is. I'm just feeding them imported solid fuel for now. That pipe heading off to the east there is towards the crude oil deposit, where I end up placing a temporary heating tower just to speed up the heating process since it's so far away. As soon as the crude oil pipeline thaws, solid fuel starts producing and the setup can heat itself without external input. You can see I'm already starting work on another module since we will need a lot of ice platforms going forward, and every module we build makes it faster to build the next one. A sort of snowball effect, if you don't mind the pun. One problem that arises is that if we use more ammonia than is overflowing from the ice platform crafting, then the chemical plants separating the solution will back up on ice and stop completely. To fix this, I have to add these belts on the outside with inserters which remove ice from the chemical plants if it's backed up, so that we can continue making ammonia for more platforms and solid fuel. As far as getting rid of the ice goes, I'm first going to be turning it into water for the power plant, and if that backs up, I'm just going to recycle it into nothingness as soon as I get some recyclers delivered from Fulgora. We can actually go one step further with that solid fuel, as if we combine it with water and more ammonia, we get rocket fuel, which has a much higher fuel value and is therefore better fuel for the heating towers. It also means that when we get around to actually launching stuff later, I have one less thing to import. I'm not quite extracting ice as fast as I'd like, so I set up quality long inserters on Fulgora to be sent over once enough have accumulated. Since we're here, I might as well mention the quality EM plant setup you can see just there below it. I have them all set up until legendary quality, even though I can't actually make any legendaries until I get Aquilo's science pack, and only just got epic quality from Gleba's science pack. I now get back to expanding my tileable ice platform build. Due to an annoying quirk with copy pasting and offshore pumps, I have to copy the middle bit first and then the belts on the top and bottom afterwards. Once the first few are down, placing the rest is much faster, and by now we're producing a bit of excess rocket fuel and can send it down to heat up the power plant and hopefully wean the base off its reliance on nuclear fuel cells, although I won't delete the reactor in case the base has a cataclysmic failure. The way that I prioritise the heating towers over the nuclear reactor is that I have a circuit to only input fuel if it's below a certain temperature, and I set the threshold on the heating towers higher than the reactor, so the reactor only gets fuel if the heating towers aren't keeping up. It's not long before the ice platform unit is so large that I set up this pump to skim off excess ammonia to use in later processes we need for the science pack of this planet. It's not filling particularly fast for now, but once ice platforms back up, I'll have more ammonia than I'll know what to do with. I'm at the point now where I can make this planet's unique building, the cryo plant. If I smelt lithium in a furnace, I get lithium plate, and by combining that with reinforced concrete, superconductor, and blue circuits, I can craft a cryo plant. Unlike other unique buildings, it doesn't get a 50% productivity boost, but it does get 8 module slots to make up for that. Holmium is actually required in lithium production, so I upgraded my production on Fulgora using productivity 3 modules and speed beacons. Back to Aquilo, I designed this modular expandable setup for lithium which combines holmium plate, lithium brine and ammonia to make raw lithium, putting some in a provider chest to be available to the robot network and putting the rest onto a belt off to be used elsewhere. To heat it up, I have a belt of excess rocket fuel for my ice platform production, which I'm going to run to heat each individual production line, since that makes it easier to wake the base up if a cataclysm occurs without having to heat the entire thing up with imports. The lithium brine comes from pump jacks placed on those lithium brine fissures, which are to my knowledge wholly unique in being both a liquid and non-infinite. I was tempted to belt the holmium over to the lithium build, but I decided to just use bots because we don't need it in massive amounts. Bots on Aquilo use 5 times as much power as on any other planet, so I am still going to minimise my use of bots going forward. The next thing we need to start producing is hot fluoroketone, essentially a coolant which is used in all of the low temperature recipes, as well as a certain new power source we're going to unlock on this planet. To craft it, we combine solid fuel, raw lithium, ammonia, and a new fluid called fluorine, which comes out of the ground like lithium brine, but is an infinite resource. The starter fluorine node we were given is absolutely pitiful, far from enough for the level of production we want, so I head out in search of a larger patch and pretty quickly find one. I go straight to set up 2 train stations down to the south, one to bring in this fluorine, and another one to bring in more lithium brine, because I'm not sure the current patch will be enough, and it will eventually run out. Whilst I wait for all the elevated rails and trains to be delivered from Vulcanus, I set up the pump jacks on the patch. The train itself will be 2-headed to save on rails, and has 1 fluid wagon for the fluorine, and 1 cargo wagon to bring rocket fuel to heat the outpost. The station at base pumps the fluorine out of the wagon and loads it up with rocket fuel from the heating belt. With hot fluoroketone finally producing, we can turn it into cold fluoroketone by just passing it through a cryogenic plant. You'll notice the pump on the hot tank to stop it filling right up. This is because most processes that use cold fluoroketone output hot fluoroketone, so I don't want their outputs being blocked by the freshly made stuff. It's the moment you've all been waiting for now. We have all the ingredients for the cryogenic science pack. It's crafted in a cryo plant by combining cold fluoroketone, ice and a lithium plate. Cryogenic plants have so many module slots I can put 2 speed 2 modules into it and still fit enough efficiency 2 modules in to bottom out its power usage. I'm just going to copy this build a few times to get us up to 60 science per minute. With great difficulty, I'm actually belting in the ice and lithium, as well as belting out the science, which will be inserted directly into a silo, unlike the usual bot delivery from other planets. This is entirely to avoid the issue of bots draining the whole power grid every time DS3 passes overhead. If you directly insert items into a silo like this and untick the automatic requests thing, then they will be launched to any space platform that passes overhead which has a request for that item. To keep up with science production, I also have to expand the lithium build massively, which is easy since I made it modular. Increased lithium production means increased lithium brine consumption, so I set up a lithium brine outpost, and conveniently, the nearest patch is not too far to the south. It's not long after that Citron DS3 brings the first load of cryogenic science pack back to Nalvis, and I can begin research, starting with legendary quality, but changing halfway through to get the artificial biter spawner, before getting quantum processors, fusion power and railguns. Typically, I forgot to unpause OBS when building quantum processor production, but it's all bot fed anyway, and is crafted by combining blue circuits, tungsten carbide, superconductor, carbon fibre and lithium plate, as well as some cold fluoroketone, which we get half of back as hot fluoroketone. I'm also setting up a little model for Aquilo's unique items, starting by combining 10 tungsten plate, 10 superconductor, 20 quantum processors and 10 cold fluoroketone, into the handheld railgun, also known as the Demolisher Shitstomper 5000. Add carbon fibre to the mix and you get the railgun turret, which will be very important in any expeditions beyond Aquilo. Next up are the fusion reactor and fusion generator, which take a fuck ton of quantum processors, superconductor and tungsten plate, and are far and away the best power generator in the entire game, and I will be making extensive use of them going forward. As you can see, I've filled all the slots in these cryo plants with quality modules, to try and get the best quality that I can. The last thing I need to set up is barreled cold fluoroketone, for reasons I will explain later. Anyway, with my work on Aquilo done, I head back to Vulcanus because our rocket production needs a big boost, starting with blue circuits. I'm using epic quality EM plants which have been slowly accumulating on Fulgara, as they have 1.9 times the crafting speed for no extra power cost. Meanwhile on Aquilo, I'm setting up fusion power cells by combining a holmium plate, 5 lithium plates and 100 ammonia. They contain 40 gigajoules of energy each, before any neighbour bonus from reactors. Back on Vulcanus, I set up plastic next using cryogenic plants to take advantage of the massive productivity boost 8 module slots can provide. I copied an entire half of my core liquefaction down here, along with upgrading to tier 3 productivity and speed modules to feed the plastic. It's probably overkill, but it means I can also send some of the excess petroleum over to the main base if required. I'm next looking at the iron and copper required to produce all of the circuits I want, but my power grid cries out in pain just looking at the requirements, so it's time to put some of that new tech to use. I start to design a fusion setup, which is a unique challenge due to how fusion power works. Each reactor takes in fusion power cells and cold fluoroketone, both of which I need to import from Aquilo, as well as 10 megawatts of power, and turns it into plasma, the temperature of which depends on how many neighbours it has. With each reactor having 2 neighbours, the plasma comes out at 3 million degrees, which is effectively 300 megawatts of power. Each generator turns 50 megawatts of plasma into 50 megawatts of power, and the same amount of hot fluoroketone as it took cold fluoroketone to make the plasma, meaning that once we get some fluoroketone into the system, we can recycle the same stuff forever. This is the design that I settle on. Usually, you need 1 cryo plant per reactor to keep it cooled, but with speed modules I get that down to 1 cryo plant per 2 reactors. One massive bonus of using fusion over fission is that the reactors only consume cells when they're producing plasma, like a burner entity consuming fuel, so they don't need any special circuitry to control fuel cell insertion. It's going to take a while for Aquilo to produce enough buildings to complete that reactor, so in the meantime I'm moving on to setting up molten metals for the circuit build. You'd be surprised how much lava you need to feed these heavily beaconed builds, and I'm sure I'll be even more shocked later on when I get around to using legendary buildings. With all the pipes set up, I'm ready to just connect up the belts and get producing circuits. It would probably be a bit more satisfying if I remembered to connect sulfuric acid first, but it did reveal that the green circuit machine is working far too fast for these 2 bulk inserters, so I double that up to 4. As soon as I connect that pipe up, the blue circuits start producing, and then I'm going to copy it 3 more times to get to the 1000 circuits a minute I wanted. That'll give us 20 rockets a minute before productivity, which after the advent of productivity 3 modules from Nalvis and rocket part productivity research using cryogenic science, will end up being more like 40 to 60 rockets a minute. 1000 LDS per minute is much simpler, and now all that's left is rocket fuel. For 1000 rocket fuel per minute, I'm making the slightly controversial move to go to Fulgara. Making it on Glaber from fruits or Aquilo from ammonia might be a better and more efficient idea, but I already have a massive amount of rocket launching infrastructure here, and the sandy ocean is literally made of heavy oil, so why not? I upgrade red and green science with yellow assemblers and speed modules, which should actually be enough to reach that 1000 eSPM target I'm aiming for this episode. The SPM figure I'm using is effective SPM, or eSPM as I've been calling it, which is how much research is done after productivity bonuses have been applied in the lab, rather than actual SPM, which is based on how many packs are crafted. As much as I would love to make 1 million packs a minute of each science pack, It's just not feasible with my, or indeed any current consumer, computer. As such, after Biolab's half science pack consumption, productivity 3 modules, and a very overpowered research I'll talk about later, it shouldn't take more than about 300 actual science packs a minute to reach 1000 eSPM. We're off to Nalvese next, where I'm combining cold fluoroketone, capture rockets, uranium-235, and biter eggs to make artificial biter nests. It's really important that I only make as many as I need, because any that I leave in chests or in my inventory will spoil into a behemoth biter after half an hour. My first use for them is to make more eggs here to make more artificial nests, and I try to use a circuit condition which only inserts eggs when there is a request for the nests in the logistics network, so that none get left over, but I didn't know until now that you can't actually read requests to fulfill entity ghosts, so my plan won't really work. Annoying, but I can still do it manually whilst off planet, so it's not the end of the world. Anyway, what I really wanted them for was to make biter eggs available to space platforms, which I do safely by reading platform requests from the rocket silo, and only inserting eggs into the silo when one is overhead requesting them. Each nest can hold up to 100 eggs, so I place 5 nests around the silo, since each rocket can hold 500 eggs. On Aquilo, I set up the necessary amount of cryoscience production to reach 1000 eSPM, as well as making quantum processors available to rockets. For the most part, I'm not going to show me upgrading the Nalvese sciences, being those up to and including space science, since that's mostly just inserting modules, but I will show the process for the rest of the planetary sciences, such as on Fulgora, where ironically, after what I just said about the Nalvese sciences, most of what I needed to do was just putting modules and beacons around the existing build. Welcome to the world, Citron C1 the second, because Citron C1 wasn't enough. Yes, it is a carbon copy, because the original is struggling to keep up with being both the MAL platform and the science delivery platform, so from now on, it'll just be the MAL platform, and Citron C1 the second will handle all of the science transport. I started building a slightly larger perimeter on Nalvese to give me a bit more room to build, but stopped halfway because I realised I didn't really have anything to fill it with yet. A red circuit shortage on Vulcanus prompted me to upgrade to using EM plants, which required some creative belt routing, since they are a whole tile wider than the assembly machines which were there before. Metallurgic science was just another insert modules kind of deal, so the last planetary science I need to sort out is Glaber, which is definitely one of the hardest to scale, so much I'm deciding to just rebuild the process from scratch. It starts off with this little sushi loop that brings in the 2 fruits and turns them into bioflux, as well as dealing with any spoilage by turning it into nutrients. It reads the belts to only put up to a maximum amount of each item onto the belt, as to not clog it up, and I effectively prioritise the nutrients from spoilage over the nutrients from bioflux by just setting its nutrients on the belt limit higher. This then feeds into some egg breeders and science crafting biochambers like I've described previously. I was really happy with the build at this point until I realised how much work it needed to make it work well. Easily, my favourite little crafty trick I had to use was here, where to get the spoilage out of the science machines, which I had forgotten to account for previously, I used priority splitters and long-handed inserters to feed it out of the side of the machines. I wanted to keep this existing footprint, but unfortunately, I didn't really have any other way to get spoilage out of the egg labs, another complete oversight on my behalf, so I had to break out the top by 2 tiles. In retrospect, I might have been able to do something with long-handed inserters and that gap next to the egg inserters into the science biochambers, but it's too late now. The best part is, if I feel like I want more science production, I can just copy this entire module down, and after a bit of nursing it to life with nutrients and manually inserting eggs, it's ready to produce agri-science forever. This isn't free, of course. We need to input more fruit into the system by doing more farming. Most of the demand is on Yumiko, so I've expanded that out to 4 towers, whereas the 2 we had for Jelly Nut will probably continue to be enough. So that's it then. All of the sciences up to about 250 packs per minute, but even after the biolab and the productivity modules, that's going to give me like 600 eSPM, nowhere near the 1000 I want. Well, we have one more science pack which might help us in that department, and to that end, please welcome our newest space platform, Toyota Yaris. We're hitting the ground running by building another 1.4 gigawatt reactor, just like we had on Vulcanus, but this time it's uncommon quality, so we're actually getting 30% more power from it. To cool it, I've got 2 uncommon cryo plants, which again need 2 tier 3 speed modules to keep up with the 2 reactors each. I give the platform a modest cargo capacity, and then add these 2 cryo plants to craft the Prometheum science pack. I'll leave you in suspense about that for now, as first I want to design the thrust for the ship. This might seem like overkill, but to fit all of the production I need, I'm going to need a pretty wide platform. And as I said earlier, to get the fastest platform you need to have thrusters covering as much of the width of the platform as you can manage. Once it's fully speed moduled, which we can afford to do thanks to the massive fusion reactor, these 8 chemical plants will provide all of the fuel we need for that massive thruster array. Next up is asteroid processing. I'm using this design where the advanced processing is first and then is followed with the basic processing if the secondary item from advanced is backed up. This is much simpler than whatever the hell I was trying to do on DS3 and C1, and this time I also remembered to plan for feeding the asteroid chunk byproducts back into the input with priority. I made the same sort of thing for iron and copper processing. I've added enough crushers to not require any speed modules to produce enough what I've calculated, so that if I have made any mistakes in my calculations, I can use the speed modules to make up the difference without having to do a massive redesign. I also decided to use stack inserters, which I unlocked on Gleber, and allow you to stack up to 4 items on top of each other on belts, to increase throughput and belt buffer storage on high demand items like iron by 4 times. Next up is carbonic processing, and for some reason I didn't use that good idea I had for the other 2, and subsequently will have to come back to fix it later. The design on the other 2 only works because the 2 products were put on separate sides of the belts immediately, meaning the primary product couldn't block the secondary from being produced, which prevented deadlocks and let the whole advanced processing priority deal work in the first place. Also, sorry to break the news, but unlike previous platforms, this one won't be symmetrical. That was just too difficult for my tiny little brain to figure out, whilst also trying to make a decently high throughput production line. Here's the ice melting, which, unlike on my previous nuclear powered platform, is really only used for fuel, oxidizer and explosives, which is why I'm getting it out of the way first. The process to turn carbon and sulfur into coal can only be done in chemical plants, but I can make the explosives in cryo plants, which saves a bit of space. We also only need copper to make copper cable for railgun ammo, so I got that out the way down here, and I can mix that onto a belt with the explosives, since they are both ingredients in railgun ammo. After a comical amount of iron plates and some steel plates, I'm ready to start making all the different ammos. Railgun ammo is made by combining steel plate, copper wire and explosives, and with a bit of belt splitting shenanigans I can bring the explosives together with iron to make rockets. Then of course all the rest of the iron plates are just turned into yellow ammo. Since we're producing copper anyway, we could technically use red ammo, but bullet DPS is the least of my concerns compared to the rockets and railguns, so it isn't really worth the extra complexity. The next part of the platform is going to be slightly controversial. You see, Prometheum science requires quantum processors, beta eggs, and something from beyond the edge of the star system, which only has a stack size of 1. The idea is that you're meant to get the eggs and then fly out to get the other thing before the eggs spoil after 30 minutes and make all the science whilst you're out there. Unfortunately for the devs, I'm like water and follow the path of least resistance, which to me is to just make these big belt tapestries to store thousands of the unstorable item and fly home with it, and then import the eggs directly from Nalvis and just make the science packs in its orbit before dropping them straight down to the surface. If you think that's cheating, all power to you, but I just see it as an effective exploitation of the game mechanics. Unfortunately, since the stack size of the item is only 1, I can't stack it with stack inserters, which would quadruple the storage capacity of this belt tapestry, which is already more than double the capacity of its equivalent in legendary cargo bays. Right at the front of the ship, I have a whopping 4 asteroid reprocessing setups, and have a defence consisting of a fuckton of gun turrets, a few rocket turrets, and the new fandangled railgun turrets. Predictably, the carbon processing is already starting to back up, so I upgrade it to the version I used for the other 2 resources. I also expanded my ice and calcite, because I had the room and somehow managed to catastrophically underbuild initially. The initial stress tests flying to Aquilo are promising. Promising meaning it did not even blink at the onslaught of big asteroids. Once at Aquilo, I got a ton of fusion cells sent up, and then it's time to begin the journey to the edge of the star system. These huge asteroids are the reason I needed the railguns to venture this far, as their massive 3000 flat defense means that only things that do more than 3000 physical damage can even hurt them, such as railgun shells. Railguns are great because they do collateral damage, meaning that when they fire at a target, they also hit everything between the end of the barrel and the target, and even a little bit past that. It's not long before I reach the solar system's edge, where I technically win the game, but we're not quite done yet. Past the edge, the only valid destination is the shattered planet, which is 4 million kilometers away, more than 200 times the distance from Nalvis to Vulcanus. Suffice to say, you aren't really meant to reach it, it's more just a target to fly towards whilst you gather what you're really here for: Promethium asteroid chunks. Once past the solar system edge, you start to encounter Promethium asteroids, which have twice the health of a normal asteroid, and we need to destroy to gather the Promethium asteroid chunks. Rather than processing the chunks that we gather, we're actually going to use it as an ingredient in the Promethium science pack. It's that difficult to start item I was talking about earlier. To make it this far out, I've had to slow down a lot just to let my turrets keep up with the asteroid killing, but that means it can take quite a while to gather a full load of Promethium. Once I've got a decent load of chunks, I can turn around to start heading back to Nalvis. It's worth noting that since you collect Promethium on the way there and on the way back, you should turn around when your storage is about halfway full, so that it'll be roughly full when you get back to the star system. I didn't get near half full this time, but that's just because it's a test run. Upon returning back to Nalvis, beta eggs are automatically sent up to the platform, and upon combining them with the Promethium chunks and some quantum chips I picked up when I swung past Aquilo, we've got our first Promethium science packs producing. You probably wonder why I care so much about Promethium science packs, as it's only used in one technology, but that technology is an absolute doozy. It takes every single science pack in the game, and has double the research time of any other research, but in return gives us 10% extra productivity on research per level. That is an absolutely massive boost, and is how I'm planning to reach that 1000 eSPM threshold for this video's main target, and will be key in reaching the series goal of 1,000,000 eSPM. Running all science at scale revealed the biggest shortcoming to surprisingly be EM science, due to a scrap shortage, so I quickly ran around and set up a few scrap outposts. With that rectified, and after letting it run for an hour to get a good average, it's with great pleasure I can reveal I slightly overshot my eSPM target by 2.6 times. Very nice. I know an hour isn't a lot of time, and there still could be some sneaky buffers which haven't yet drained, but it's a good enough check for this episode, because I didn't want to wait around for 10 hours looking at the average, when this isn't nearly the final goal for the series. On the journey to 1,000,000 eSPM in Factorio, the most important step is the acquisition of legendary buildings and modules. The best path to acquiring the legendary buildings we want for the final Megabase is strenuous, occasionally cursed, often annoying, and heavily RNG dependent. In this episode, I'm going to travel to each planet, set up processes to produce every legendary item we're going to need, and casually on the side, increase our eSPM by another order of magnitude. I'm starting where we left off last time, on Fulgora, and begin by stripping the whole place of epic and legendary quality module 3s and EM plants. I then immediately leave, because even if Fulgora is arguably the home of quality, the real seat of power is the fiery hellhole of Vulcanus. I head out into the boonies in search of a decent calcite patch, and in the process show why the handheld railgun earned the title of the Demolisher Shitstomper 5000. I shot some miners down on the calcite, and run the belt down to a decent sized open area nearer my base, which is where I'm going to try to process all of the non-planet specific legendary items. This starts by making a lot of good old molten iron and copper. Okay, so for those of you who don't have a foggy about quality or how it works, I'll give you a quick crash course. Every item has 5 quality tiers, starting with common, which is the default, and then going up through uncommon, rare, epic, and legendary. When crafting an item, you can put quality modules into the crafting machine to add quality chance, which dictates the likelihood that a crafted item will be of an increased quality. Say the quality chance was 20% and you're using common ingredients, then if you craft 10 items, on average 2 of them will be uncommon. There is also a 10% chance of a further quality increase, which can stack multiple times. So if you crafted 1000 items, 2 will be epic, 18 will be rare, 180 will be uncommon, and the rest will come out as common. As you can see here, I've built a setup to make higher quality green circuits from common iron and copper, and you might notice that I haven't used any speed beacons, which is because speed modules actually confer a negative quality bonus. It won't decrease the quality of any higher quality items, but it will make you less likely to get a quality increase from a craft. Another important concept is that you can craft items using higher quality ingredients, which guarantees an output of that quality. For instance, I'm taking uncommon iron plates and copper cable off this belt and feeding them into an EM plant crafting uncommon green circuits, which with the quality modules means we will always at least get an uncommon circuit, but will have a chance to upgrade to rare or higher. The final key to this whole process is here, where we're using recyclers to turn circuits of any quality back into the ingredients of that given quality. It only returns 25% of the items that were taken to craft the circuit, but we can actually put quality modules into the machine, which means when we recycle a circuit of a given quality, we actually have a chance to get ingredients back of a higher quality. This is great because usually you get that initial, say, 20% chance to get a higher quality item, and that's it, and you have to deal with lower quality items too. But using this system, we not only deal with the overflow of unnecessary low quality items, we also get to cheekily roll the dice again on a quality upgrade when we recycle the overflow. This works pretty well, and you can see it didn't even take that long to get a legendary green circuit. I had a play around with setting up this modular circuit heavy thing, which was meant to automatically upcycle items, but it didn't really turn out that well. That little green circuit setup was pretty useful for explaining how quality works, but I actually found a much better way to get the result we want, so I'd demolish it and start over. I start, paradoxically, with taking the quality modules out of the green circuit plants, instead putting productivity and speed modules in the whole thing. With that metric fuck ton of green circuits, I can make an imperial shit ton of red circuits, and I can combine them both with sulfuric acid to make just a normal amount of blue circuits. At the heart of all quality processes are of course recyclers, and I'm putting in some effort here to improve their throughput by pouring their outputs into a chest and using circuits to only pull items out of the chest if there's more than 16 of them, so that the output is always fully stacked. The next obvious step is to craft those products back into blue circuits, and I do also include a belt to remove overflow so it doesn't back up. Although as the buffers fill and the build stabilises, that should be less and less necessary. What's not obvious is my choice of modules for the EM plants, because rather than the obvious choice of quality modules, I've gone with productivity modules. This might seem like a poor choice, since we're essentially halving our rate of quality upgrades, but something interesting happens with items like blue circuits where we can get the productivity to absurd values. If we reach level 13 blue circuit productivity, so plus 130% productivity, add on the 50% from the EM plants, and finally 125% from 5 legendary productivity modules, which we'll get soon, that comes out to 305% productivity, although there is a cap on all items at 300%, so actually 300% productivity. Since recyclers return a quarter of the ingredients of whatever you put in, and the EM plants now produce 4 times the products of whatever ingredients you put in, these now cancel out, and recycling the circuits loses no material, whilst still having a chance to upgrade the quality. In simple terms, the amount of common blue circuits we put in will be equal to the number of legendary blue circuits we pull out. It's not going to operate at full capacity until we set up legendary productivity 3 modules and finish researching blue circuit productivity level 13. But for now it can still chug along, suboptimally producing legendary blue circuits. Elsewhere, I've launched a new space platform, Casino Royale. That's right, for this video we're naming the platforms after Bond films. My initial plan for this one was a typical one and done ship that I could copy as many times as necessary, but I actually think its mysterious and important purpose is more fitting of a modular, expandable build. I start off with this engine block, and then it's time to work on what we're putting on top of it. I've put down these crushers, whose purpose I'll explain momentarily, but right at the front of the ship I'm putting a massive block of solar panels, and then laser turrets? You might think I've gone insane, but at the velocities this ship will be operating at, and of course with a decent level of damage upgrades, they can more than keep up, and it saves with the complexity of making ammo. Taking it for a test flight, the laser turrets absolutely flatline my power grid, but against all odds still manage to defend the platform decently well. The only real solution is more power, and rather than making the ship even taller, I decided to set up quality solar panels on Vulcanus using the same design I was previously using for quality on Fulgora. Okay, so now I'll explain what that massive array of crushers is for. The asteroid reprocessing recipes in crushers are used to turn asteroid chunks randomly either back into themselves or into another type of chunk. My plan is to put quality modules into this process so that every time an asteroid is reprocessed we get a chance to upgrade its quality. The first big loop reprocesses common chunks, with any greater qualities being pulled off the sushi belt onto a loop that reprocesses uncommon chunks. And rinse and repeat until we're left with legendary chunks which can be crushed into legendary iron, copper, carbon, sulfur, calcite and ice. After a few more test flights, I more than half the number of laser turrets and add some more accumulators to try and solve the power issue, but it's still not enough. I'm not really that worried however, since as we copy more modules the ratio of useful solar panel containing space to useless dead space outside the ship that the laser turrets cover will decrease, so power will be less and less of a problem. All the legendary products come out through a belt in the middle, and are run past some filtered inserters which have the items the hub has less than 500 of whitelisted. Here's the true beauty of this design. As soon as it's not enough, we just copy and paste a new one, and once the equipment's been shipped up, it just works. A soft side goal I have for this episode is to get an unstacked green belt of each science pack, starting here with green science. That's 3600 packs per minute, which by the end of the episode with legendary prod modules and a good few more research productivity levels will come out to something in the ballpark of 36,000 eSPM. Nice. I also set up red science, although it's waiting on a few beacons to craft so won't be at full tilt yet. By now, enough legendary blue circuits have crafted that I can start to recycle the excess, giving us access to legendary red and green circuits. In other news, I can combine the legendary carbon and sulfur from Casino Royale with water to make legendary coal, which we can immediately turn into legendary plastic. Legendary calcite can be turned into legendary stone using the molten metal from lava recipe, although I really should have used lava to copper because that actually gives more stone. Finally, legendary iron and copper ore can just be smelted straight into legendary iron and copper plates. To my knowledge, there is no purpose for legendary ice, unless we want to ship it over to Aquilo and make legendary cryoscience for some reason. Now we've roughly automated the main conventional resources, my next task is legendary holmium, since we need it to mass produce legendary tier 3 quality modules. I run out into the wilderness of Fulgara to find an appropriate site to set it up, and find one not only nearby, but actually on the same island as my main base. The first step is setting up some train stations to bring scrap in. Unfortunately, there's two very rich scrap islands nearby, so resources are in no short supply. I'm then processing the scrap directly into active provider chests, using quality modules in the process to try and roll for some higher quality items, to make the climb up to legendary not as steep when we get to the main legendary holmium production loop. When it comes to making holmium solution, you can't have quality fluids, which means that we need a different chemical plant for every quality of holmium ore we get, but all of the output can go into the same pipe. We also need a different machine for every quality of ice, even though it all just turns into water. I don't know how feasible this is, but I think it would be good if the developers made it so recipes like these that only produce qualityless fluids could take ingredients of any quality. Turning the holmium solution into plates, you can only craft common items if the ingredients are all fluid, so I put quality modules in that too to gamble them up. I set up a quality upcycler for EM plants over here, as well as the item trasher you can see below it. It works just like the old one, where it requests items which the robot network has more than a certain threshold of, and recycles them to stop anything clogging up the system. But this time it has quality modules, so even when we're breaking stuff down, we're still rolling that dice. I make refined concrete for the EM plants, which again, we need a different machine for every single quality. And finally, we can start to produce EM plants. You might wonder then, how do I plan to use all of this to get legendary holmium? Surely not from the trick I get from the foundries. The answer is simple. EM plants take holmium plate to craft, so if we can upcycle enough of them to legendary, we can recycle those EM plants into some of the legendary holmium we want. We're getting two for the price of one, really. The legendary EM plants we'll need for the final Megabase, and the legendary holmium we're going to need for a few of different uses. Legendary quality modules chief among them. I expand to a second upcycling setup to hopefully improve production, although we're more likely to have an ingredient shortage than any issue with crafting speed. Back on Vulcanus, I'm setting up a legendary quality 2 modules, as it turns out they're the second best quality module after the legendary tier 3s, even better than epic tier 3s. Next up is a legendary productivity modules, which you might recall we need to make the most out of a legendary blue circuit build. To get the legendary eggs that requires, I'm using this dead simple system which shots all the eggs on a loop and just continuously recycles any non-legendary ones until only legendary ones remain. This simplicity leads to inefficiency, as it takes more than 1,000 common eggs to make one legendary one. So the smart thing to do would have been to set this up on Nalvese and just ship the legendary ones over. But when do I ever do the smart thing? Meanwhile on Fulgora, I've set up rocket fuel and rockets for our legendary holmium production. One of these rocket silos is for the legendary holmium itself, and the other is for the legendary EM plants. The major bottleneck for legendary modules right now is red circuits, since they only come from breaking down blue circuits. So I set up this machine which makes legendary red circuits if we're short on them, and have an excess of the ingredients. By now, I've expanded Casino Royale enough that the power issues are resolved, even with that big chunk of solar panels waiting to be constructed there. We've also started to get a few legendary productivity modules crafting, and being only a few levels away from Blue Circuit Productivity 13, we'll soon have our 1-to-1 common to legendary Blue Circuit build completed. Over on Nalvese, I'm feeling a bit cramped in my tiny little cookbox, so I finally finished that massive perimeter I started building. That's all so I can set up some much larger egg production. This one keeps the eggs in the nests so they don't start spoiling until a platform requests eggs, and then burns off any that were left on the belt and in the silos once the platform leaves and the request is no longer present. I really want to be able to research silly levels of mining productivity to make later processes easier, so I start setting up 3600 SPM Blue Science next. Naturally, the number of buildings needed to craft enough sulfur is comically small for such a big number. If you think that's bad, wait until we start playing with legendary buildings. I quickly realised that the setup I copied from Green Science for Blue Science production was only made for 2 inputs, and so therefore wouldn't work, so I needed to redesign to fit 3 inputs instead. Engines can also use that same design, and thanks to how overpowered foundries are, we need surprisingly few buildings to feed the massive stack. I came up with this pretty nice design for red circuits, which can be fed by a pretty small green circuit build, and feeds straight into the science build, completing our target of 3600 SPM. And then I made purple science. Yeah, I forgot to unpause OBS. What are you going to do about it? Thankfully, I took the time to show off the whole thing afterwards, once I realised. It's built for 3600 SPM, just like the rest, but funnily enough we can't actually sustain that yet, because all the stone comes from making molten metal, and we don't quite use enough molten metal to make enough stone to fully saturate purple science. Although by the time the rest of the sciences are set up later, we most certainly will. The next thing I want is legendary tungsten, which I really don't have a good solution for. As you can see, we're starting off with some quality moduled miners, loading onto a train, where I'm using this very over-engineered thing with a rocket silo to upcycle it using the same idea as with the biter eggs. Since we're already getting legendary carbon from space, we can use this to make legendary tungsten carbide for foundries, big miners and speed module 3s. Elsewhere, I've found a way to turn molten iron and copper directly into legendary steel and copper plate. And no, you can't just set the casting recipe in a foundry to be a higher quality. That would be too easy. Once I get LDS productivity to level 15, then we get into the same situation as with blue circuits, where we can recycle LDS back into the same amount of ingredients as it takes to craft one. That means I can use the legendary LDS casting recipe, which takes in legendary plastic and both molten metals, then scrap the legendary LDS that produces, which gives us back all the plastic we used to craft it, as well as a legendary steel and copper, since scrapping returns the output of the default recipe. With most basic legendary resources automated, I get started on my legendary mall, where I'll be making most legendary buildings. I've started off with asteroid collectors, since they get the most benefit of any building from higher quality, and crushers, since one of the first big uses for all of our legendary stuff will be better space platforms. It's not long before I've got a decent little mall going. There are very few legendary buildings which I can't automate with the materials I have automated now, although producing them at any great scale will still be an issue. In other news though, the legendary blue circuit build finally has all of the productivity modules it needs, so it's converting common to legendary 1-to-1, even if it's not at the greatest pace. Fulgora has also produced a whopping 164 legendary holmium, and I can reduce the launch threshold so that we don't have to wait right up until 1,000 accumulate every time before some get launched. 164 might not sound like a lot, but each plate can be turned into 6 legendary quality module 3s. So that right there is going to get us 984 legendary quality module 3s. It's time now to send up our next space platform, Goldfinger. The general idea for this one is to supersede our first generation inner planet haulers, the Citron C1s, with something much faster, since we've got a lot more science to move around now. These legendary cargo bays have twice the capacity of the common ones, so even if our cargo bay ends up looking small, there's a good chance it'll still be competitive. The legendary thrusters are also great because they effectively act as 2.5 common thrusters, but without the added width that would confer, so it allows the platform to go much faster. After a lot of fiddling around, I end up with something a bit like this, and then immediately decide I hate it and destroy it. The truth is, symmetry is overrated, so after I've placed the cargo bays down, I immediately place down this wonky nuclear power plant. Although this is a smaller power plant than that of the Citron C1s, that's fine because even though legendary buildings get a 2.5 times stats boost, they don't actually require any more power, so you get a lot more done with a lot less power demand. At the front of the platform, I'm obviously using legendary collectors to maximise resources gathered, but for the gun turrets I'm actually only using common, since all legendary does is increase range, and with damage upgrades as high as mine are, that just means we waste more ammo shooting asteroids out to right or left, which have no chance of ever hitting the platform. All the asteroids feed onto this loop, which uses circuits to reprocess any asteroids we have too many of. Below that there are the actual asteroid processing crushers, and then the ammo, fuel and oxidizer production. Thanks to the power of legendaries, even this tiny setup can make 10 yellow ammo per second, which should be far more than I need. I very messily managed to bend the ammo belt down to the very bottom of the ship, where this singular gun turret will protect the thrusters and sides of the ship whilst it's stationary in orbit. Although preferably, it would never be stationary enough for that to be an issue. The only advanced asteroid crushing recipe I actually need is calcite, so I have this circuit which changes the ice crusher to that advanced recipe when we need more calcite, and to the basic if we have enough. I think that should be about right, so it's time to send it off on a test flight and see how it fares. Despite some impressive acceleration, it almost immediately flounders due to a lack of calcite, although that's more than expected due to the low spawn rate of oxide asteroids around these parts. It continues to fluctuate heavily even towards the end of the trip, although the results are impressive. It's on the return trip that it shines, as now that the buffers have been filled, it's hitting nearly 500 kilometers a second, fast enough to go from one planet to another in around 30 seconds. Soon enough, I'm confident enough to set its requests so that it can begin transporting science from Vulcanus to Nalvis. To make the most out of its extreme speed, I'll end up giving each inner planet one, but for now, I'll let Citron C1 deal with Fulgora and Glaber for us. Obviously the old lab setup on Nalvis won't be able to handle us increasing SPM by a factor of 10, so I set to work on a new design. The final million eSPM design will probably need to use belts for practicality reasons, but I don't see why we can't indulge with bots for just this episode to speed things along and save that design for next time. Back on Vulcanus, I built a much bigger blue circuit upcycling setup, since the original one was pretty slow, and realistically we've got the supply to handle a setup even 100 times bigger than this one. Back on Nalvis, that old nuclear plant isn't nearly enough to keep up with the new science setup and all the robots it requires, so I built a 4x4 reactor which I can copy as many times as needed going forward to keep up. Soon, Nalvis is going to become very important, and we'll need to launch a lot of rockets, so it doesn't make sense for it to get all of its rocket parts from Vulcanus, especially since with our quickly ballooning mining productivity levels, mined resources are going to be functionally infinite. Big mining drills automatically produce full stacks of resources, meaning these single belts of ore are as good as 4 unstacked belts. I combined the ore with calcite, which we unfortunately do still need to import from Vulcanus, to make molten metal. I then turned that into green circuits and then red circuits, the plastic for which coming from this oil build I just put together. The blue circuits are up next. After all of the work with quality I've been doing, making just common items feels almost too easy. I copied down 2 more 4x4 reactors, and rather than wait for all of those buildings to get shipped over from Vulcanus, I automated everything but the reactor locally. I also put those circuits I set up to use on this. A big array of Productivity Module 3 upcyclers, which will from now on be our main source of legendary Productivity 3 modules. It's essentially just a higher throughput version of the ones I set up on Fulgora, where we're crafting a load of Productivity 3 modules of quality, recycling all non-legendary ones of quality, and recrafting all the different quality ingredients into modules until they've been upgraded to legendary. Over on Vulcanus, I've set up a legendary big miners, next to the legendary foundries I forgot to mention I built earlier, but were used to build Goldfinger. Then, on Aquilo, it's time for the very anticlimactic creation of legendary lithium. Since the lithium crafting recipe takes holmium plate and then 2 fluids, all we need to do is send over legendary holmium plate and we can turn it straight into legendary lithium. Legendary lithium is only really useful for legendary cryo plants, unless you want to combine it with legendary ice for legendary cryoscience for some reason, which also requires legendary reinforced concrete, so I set up a decent supply on Vulcanus for me to ship over. Funnily enough, I know I've been crafting legendary foundries up to this point, but I don't know where the legendary reinforced concrete came from for that. It doesn't take long after that for a few legendary cryo plants to accumulate, which I'll need for my next new platform when I get to that. The next 4 hours of footage are completely gone. When I try to look at it in VLC, it's just the same frozen frame for 4 hours and 8 minutes. So we're picking up in media res as I'm upgrading Glaber. In that time, I set up this admittedly not very good carbon fibre build, which processes Umicore into mash and lets some of it spoiled turn into carbon and combines the rest with that carbon to make the carbon fibre. I also set up overgrowth soil by combining each artificial soil with bite eggs, spoilage, water and its respective fruit seed. This soil allows us to plant fruit anywhere in its respective biome, not just in the fertile soil and swamp. After an artillery range upgrade, a massive attack wave to the south knocked out 2 entire agri-science modules, which is totally not annoying. Back on Vulcanus quickly, here's 3600 SPM of yellow science, using all legendary buildings and modules. I'm not joking, it genuinely is that small. I launched up a new platform, Thunderball, which I initially planned to be my space science ship before I found a better solution. Don't worry, I will find a use for it later. My better solution for space science was to just stick it onto the end of Casino Royale, since it's constantly going back and forth between Vulcanus and Nalvis anyway. Making yellow science used up all of my accumulated legendary productivity 3 modules, but once a few more have crafted, they'll get sent up to finish it off. Those of you paying attention to the platform list will have noticed Skyfall appear a few clips ago. This is my mid-game Aquilo platform I made using legendary buildings and modules, the construction of which was unfortunately another victim of the loss of 4 hours of footage. So I recorded a little once-over so you can see it now. Back on Vulcanus again, I set up 3600 SPM of military science, to make the stone for which I'm just making an absolute fuck ton of molten copper and force pumping it into the overall system. Cheese haters, cover your eyes and ears now. I'm not quite getting rid of molten copper fast enough, so I make this setup to void it. Basically, I use circuits to set the LDS recipe in those foundries for a frame at a time every few frames, which under normal circumstances would cause the fluid to backflow into the pipe. But, due to the pumps running into the foundries, there's nowhere for the fluid to go, so it just gets deleted. This section was meant to be all about Glaber, so I'll get back over there now. The next legendary product I want is highly atypical, starting here with creating nutrients from bioflux and immediately recycling it into spoilage with quality. It then goes on to this circular belt which takes the common spoilage, crafts it into nutrients with quality, and then immediately recycles that back into spoilage with quality. Similar to what we did with asteroid processing, the uncommon spoilage is passed on to another loop which does the same thing, except with uncommon nutrients. Then rare, rinse and repeat until we're left with the mythical and much sought after legendary rot. The next step in my nefarious plan is this setup, which creates pentapod eggs and upcycles them using recyclers, like I did with biter eggs, until we get a legendary pentapod egg. This culminates in this setup, which crafts our legendary spoilage into legendary nutrients to breed legendary pentapod eggs and use those to craft legendary biochambers. To prevent the system using legendary nutrients as fuel, all the legendary nutrient inserters aiming into biochambers can only insert if the target biochamber has common nutrients in its inventory. As it turns out, we weren't quite making enough legendary spoilage to support the egg breeding, so I designed this module which uses chests, stack inserters and circuits to ensure that only full stacks are placed onto the belt and make a much bigger upcycling setup. Now that I've got legendary biochambers, I can do what I came here to do and set up my 3600 SPM of agri-science, starting by running off into the boonies so I have enough room and farmland. Once there, I set up this little artillery outpost so that I can clear out the local area of any potential spore huffers. It's not long before some Boy Scouts come a-knocking, and we get here our first look at some of the higher evolution pentapods. Overgrowth soil production is very closely linked to how much of that biome's fruit you use, since you need seeds from processing it to make the soil. Since jelly nut is used a lot less than Yumiko, I place my jelly nut production straight onto fertile land, so I can just use regular purple artificial soil and don't need to wait 5 to 10 business decades for enough purple overgrowth to produce. Legendary biochambers with legendary modules are insane in practice, as this setup with only 3 buildings provides enough bioflux for about 10,000 SPM of agri-science. The biggest problem at this scale is moving items between machines fast enough, as we need to put almost 200 Yumiko mash and almost 150 jelly into the bioflux machine every second. That requires 3 full legendary bulk inserters to move. Then it needs at least 4 rare stack inserters to get the 120 bioflux a second out, since I haven't set up the legendary ones yet, and rare is the highest I can reasonably gamble for. We then need to put the nutrients in and take any spoilage out, and with 1 inserter for each, that brings us to 12 inserters coming in or out of this machine. Of the 12 non-long inserters we could possibly fit. The Yumiko farm required for this is gargantuan, and there's not enough fertile land around to avoid using overgrowth soil. A very large amount of construction bot missing warnings from Nalvis alerts me to something suspicious, which upon investigation turns out to be a thoroughly overfilled landing pad, which is now spilling items out all over the ground. Nothing a few legendary cargo bays won't fix, I suppose, but there really should be a warning if you're requesting more items than your landing pad can hold. With that slowly resolving itself in the background, I bring my attention back to Glaber, where I'm spitballing my agri-science modules. Literally everything is made of bioflux, so I've solved most of the problem already, and just need to make a load of nutrients to feed egg breeding, the excess from which I combine with more bioflux to make that yummy agri-science. We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming for something which is not a sponsor. Kind of. As it turns out, you guys are pretty cool, so when I set a goal on my Ko-Fi to pretty please get 185 crisp pound sterling to upgrade my shit-ass 13-year-old computer so I might actually finish this series, I expected to hit the target in a few weeks, but instead had it quadrupled in a day. I was very happy. Here's a picture of all the new computery bits, and here's me thanking everyone who donated to meet and exceed the goal from the bottom of my heart. We now return to your regularly scheduled and newly performance drop free programming. Even though green overgrowth soil produces much faster owing to us using more Umicore, we also need a lot more of it, again because we use more Umicore. For this reason, I set up some Umicore farms on a small patch of fertile dirt to at least allow the setup to start working before all the overgrowth soil has been crafted. I then decided that since I had such a gargantuan bioflux production, I might as well just double up the science production to 7200 SPM to offset any loss from spoilage, as well as the fact that this science cannot be buffered. Over on Aquilo, I'm combining stone, carbon fibre, tungsten plate, lithium, and cold fluoroketone to make foundation. And although it just looks like fancy landfill, it's actually very important because it allows us to build over Vulcanus' lava and Fulgora's oil ocean. It is, however, prohibitively expensive, so it doesn't entirely trivialise those planet space constraints, but it allows us to take a few shortcuts on Vulcanus and completely changes how we think about power on Fulgora. I'm setting up upcycling of tool belts on Glaber, not because I'm particularly bothered about my inventory space, most work is done by bots at this point anyway, but because it's a pretty surefire way to get legendary carbon fibre, which I want for legendary stack inserters. That's not even the most problematic ingredient, however, since they also need legendary jelly, which is difficult due to its transience. It's not good enough to simply stockpile legendaries when they'll spoil after 10 minutes. We need to have a steady and consistent supply, which I support by making a fuck ton of jelly and recycling it with quality until the few legendaries remain. Even this might not be enough. The next science on Santa's list that's been a good boy and is therefore getting gruesomely distended for Christmas is EM science. Trust me, it does not go easily. As you can see, I'm making use of Foundation to connect the chosen island up to my existing power grid, saving all the fuss about finding an island with enough space to make enough power and enough production. I'm also foregoing the free power of Fulgora for the practically unlimited power of fusion, since why harness the power of a planet when you can harness the power of the sun? When all the equipment comes, anyway. For the actual EM science production, I ended up with this. Buffers aren't really something I used on the other science builds, but they're actually pretty important because space logistics is discrete, not continuous. The platforms are only there for a very small amount of time, and therefore the buffer allows the setup to function non-stop rather than getting backed up whilst the platform's off delivering. I'm immediately struck by a wall of what's essentially logistical writer's block. There's so much to set up for this science pack, and it's hard to know where to start. When built at scale, and without bots, EM science goes from being one of the easiest sciences to set up to the hardest by a country mile. Fulgora simply does not do volume, but to get the level of science production we want, it is volume we must produce. In an effort to simplify the scrap handling area, I make the decision to deliver gears to the accumulator crafting and recycle them into iron on site. It doesn't seem like much, but when you see the hell I go through with scrap sorting soon, it's well appreciated. Once I've got my ingredient crafting mostly locked in, it's time to delve down that dark path. My first idea is these scrap recycling sushi belts, which, if anything, proves I wasn't paying any attention to the throughput requirements, because I'm trying to cram the 4 stacked belts of throughput I need onto 1 belt. Time to say bye bye to that then. Here's idea 2, which is again not even worth talking about because I still haven't bothered to check the actual throughput requirements of this thing. I'm then interrupted, mid-ponder, by an alert that Goldfinger got destroyed by biters. It turns out that because science was backed up waiting on cryogenic packs, Goldfinger never dropped off any science packs at Nalvis, and therefore on return to Vulcanus, wouldn't even stop since its conditions were already met, leading to it not dropping the biter eggs for that old prod module setup, which led to them spoiling and eating the platform hub. I added a wait condition to fix that, but as soon as those very nearly spoiled eggs touched down on Vulcanus, they started hatching as the bots were taking them to the upcycling setup, leading to this mess. Since Vulcanus has no pollution, there's nothing actually incentivising them to attack, so it's not either going to rip the whole planet apart, but they are doing dredges of damage as they target onto turrets, so I leave a healthy spread of laser turrets to whittle them down in the background. Even better though, some of the eggs I put into the trash slots on Goldfinger got shot down to Nalvis, where there is no turrets around the landing pad, so it got fucking eaten. Tens of thousands of every type of science pack, as well as a good few legendary buildings, gone in the blink of an eye. Still cheaper than losing Goldfinger though, so I don't reload. Thankfully Citroen C1 still had a landing pad on board, so I can shoot it down to replace the old one. By far the funniest bit of Rube Goldberg fuckery this caused was here though, where due to having no landing pad, the biter nests haven't been getting any bioflux and therefore broke free. Although the previously captured nests are blacklisted from getting shot by turrets, the biters they spawn are not, and the flamethrowers from the original perimeter have been barbecuing the biters and burning down the nests with the AoE damage. Anyway, we were meant to be working on Fulgora. I yet again destroyed the scrap setup, although you can see it did manage to make a bit of EM science, which is getting launched up. Just far from enough for it to satisfy 3600 SPM. Attempt 3, I at least made 2 lanes of scrap product throughput, but it still isn't enough, so it too must go. My next plan involves making multiple smaller modules that handle maybe a fully stacked belt of scrap, and then copying it 3 more times to get the 4 stacked belts we need. You can see here, I'm recycling directly into a cargo wagon with filtered slots, which is much more compact than using splitters to separate it all out. My plan is to void all the high throughput items individually for maximum efficiency, such as recycling excess gears into iron plates and then crafting and recycling chests to get rid of them as fast as possible. The same can be done for concrete by crafting and recycling hazard concrete, and for steel by crafting and recycling steel chests. I tried to get rid of the rest by just dumping it into 2 recyclers aiming into each other, because at this point I didn't quite realise how silly an idea that was. After that almost immediately backed up, I used a looping belt instead, which pulled items off to recycle and dumped the product back on. That worked for a while, so I copied the whole thing 4 times to get the throughput I needed. To decompress from what was becoming a very frustrating build, I turned my focus to Glaber for a moment to set up this very nice carbon fibre build. Rather than waiting for mash to spoil to turn into carbon, this recycles nutrients for spoilage to make it, which speeds up the process massively. Back to hell. Using foundation I can bring in 4 stacked belts of scrap from another island. You might complain that this isn't heckin' wholesome modular, because the scrap mines will eventually run out, but I've got like 120 mining productivity levels at this point, so that won't be an issue this century. The scrap processing itself needs a decent amount of legendary stack inserters, so I set up direct upcycling for the monk labour to assault the problem on two fronts. Anyway, who'd have guessed it, but those recycling loops have backed up, so I attached two auxiliary setups on the top, which obviously does nothing to solve the issue. So it's time for redesign 5? Right, we're going back to basics with this one. Every different item will have its own dedicated recycling setup, which will be specifically designed to destroy it as quickly and space efficiently as possible. Stone and chromium can't be crafted into anything on their own, so they just get two recyclers running into each other, but red circuits is more involved, starting of course with recycling them. I then destroy the copper wire by recycling it into plate and crafting it back into copper repeatedly. Plastic bars can be recycled back into themselves in a loop, and the green circuits are getting recycled in the same machine as the green circuits from the blue circuits, the copper wire being put into the same loop which gets rid of the copper wire from red circuits. Iron plates are then just recycled into themselves for space efficiency, as I'm trying to keep this all in the same width footprint. There are far too many moving parts in this to talk through the whole thing in that much detail, but here's an overview of the complete thing, which still didn't work. It turns out I'd forgotten to deal with batteries, but that's easily fixed. At this point, we still aren't getting 3600 SPM, and I don't quite know why. We have enough recyclers on scrap, nothing's backed up. What's happening? I actually solved this issue while messing around off camera, but as it turns out, if we only have one inserter feeding into the recyclers, they actually weren't getting enough material in. But since everything moves so fast, it's not obvious looking at the animations on the machine, only when actually in the crafting menu. Those few frames that the machine is empty at a time actually meant the machine was only working like 70% of the time, which is why we weren't reaching 3600 SPM. It works great now. With that hell complete, I'm free to get back to work on some nicer projects, such as this massive egg extraction facility on Nalvese I'm going to use to boost my legendary Prod 3 production, as well as later on use for making legendary biolabs. This thing makes an unstacked belt of eggs, which we're then upcycling to hopefully get a few dozen legendary eggs an hour. All the rest of the ingredients are of course just coming from Vulcanus, and I got very optimistic with the level of Prod 3 production we're actually going to be able to do here. There's very few legendary resources or buildings left for me to set up, so I focus on getting cryogenic science up to 3600 SPM. This should, I hope, be a pretty easy one, besides the whole heating gimmick of Aquilo. Thanks to the amount of module slots cryo plants have, along with the multiplicative effect of productivity and speed modules, this is all the production we need for cryoscience, which generally has one of the longer crafting times of all the science packs. This is all going to need a lot more power than that little fusion reactor can provide, so I built a slightly larger one to tide us over. Lithium is a doozy thanks to the power of productivity, and with these legendary buildings there are very few ingredients we're going to need more than one crafting machine for here. There's not much new with this build compared to the smaller one I already have, except for the fact that in the absence of my big ice platform and rocket fuel build to balance my ammonia production, I'm simply voiding any excess using the same process I had to void molten copper from military science. I got myself in a bit of a mess here because I forgot that hot fluoroketone wants raw lithium, not the smelted stuff, so I needed to do some shenanigans to make that fit, which is harder than you might expect when everything needs a heat pipe next to it. All that's left then is to connect up new outposts for lithium brine and fluorine. Once I've weeded out a few minor issues, we're soon printing out cryoscience like it's nobody's business. At the other end of the temperature spectrum, I head back to Vulcanus to set up 3600 SPM of metallurgic science packs. Metallurgic science is even more of a runt than cryoscience, being very simple to make and having absolutely nothing interesting about it at all. I've actually got a pretty big shortage of legendary tungsten carbide for the foundries and speed 3 modules. So similar to what I did with eggs on Nalvis, I set up a massive tungsten mine, and then threw the ore in the thousands into recyclers to skim a few legendary tungsten off to boost production. The reason for the tungsten shortage is because in space, shit's getting real, as I'm standing up the space platform Spectre, which will be our new Prometheum science ship. Unlike last time, I'm going to try to match Prometheum science production to the rest of the science packs, which is not an easy task. Of course, at the centre of it all is the science production itself. The crafting speed for Prometheum science is insane, so these 2 machines are more than enough. The issue is putting enough chunks into the machines to sustain it. Those Tesla turrets around the machine are there in case any eggs hatch mid-flight, because rather than cheese Prometheum collection like on the Yaris, we're going to do it the intended way on Spectre. I start off with yellow ammo because that's the easiest. You could very easily argue for using red ammo on a ship like this, but I'm not going to because a later design choice makes gun turrets nearly useless. Next up is coal synthesis and explosives, although I appear to have forgotten to set the recipe on the cryo plants. Combining the explosives with iron plate gets us rockets, and I'm actually combining those rockets with more explosives to get explosive rockets. More on that later. Last of all is railgun ammo. This might not look like a massive amount of production, but given the number of railguns you can actually fit on a platform of this width, remember we can't double them up because they destroy anything they shoot through, this is enough production to accommodate for many shooting speed upgrades to come. Routing iron and copper ore ends up being a humongous pain in the arse in this little space, since we need slightly more than half a belt of iron ore, so I need to fiddle around getting 2 belts in this gap, but I make it work before I realised I forgot to account for the asteroids coming out of the process. Rather than rebuild the outputs, I turn the input belt into a loop and use circuits to control when more metallic asteroid chunks can be added on, as to not back it all up. I had the same issue with oxide crushing, having built it before that epiphany, so I just used a circuit to only let asteroid chunks in when they were non-buffered in front of the crusher. I had no major issues with carbonic since I built it after I had that epiphany, and to balance them all I used a similar system to that aboard Casino Royale, just without the quality modules. The nose of this platform is an absolute mess. You can see the 4 belts which form that artery you might have noticed running through the ship, which is there to escort Prometheum asteroid chunks directly from the asteroid collectors towards science production. All the other chunk types are just dumped into the reprocessing loop and sorted out of it to their respective locations, which might seem crude for such a high throughput ship, but with such high productivity from modules in the ammo crafting, and from asteroid processing productivity research, we really don't use many chunks. It's a surprisingly short time before enough fuel and ammo have accumulated for me to send Spectre out to gather resources and fill its buffers. It has remarkably few gun turrets since most DPS will rely on the explosive rockets, which means that funnily enough it's quite weak in the inner planet space, although it does just about scrape by. I did experiment for a while with letting the rocket turrets target medium asteroids directly, but that causes this to happen since the rockets can and will friendly fire, which is obviously not ideal. I set up legendary rocket turrets on Glaber since the further away the rockets can find their target, the less likely they are to shoot when it's nearby. So along with just limiting the rocket turrets to shooting big asteroids, our friendly fire problem should be fixed. I'm attending to something or another on Nalvis when a ton of destroyed alerts come through. I presumably wasn't wearing headphones at the time, so I was none the wiser, but we will find the source of it soon. Regardless, Spectre soon reaches the solar system edge for the first time, and we can see how it holds up in interstellar space. Honestly, for a while, I was confident it might be able to hold full speed all the way out, but alas, it starts letting through asteroids, so I'm going to need to set up some sort of throttling system. In other news, here's the source of those alerts. It chose a good time to die when its successor was in the final stages of development. Anyway, I got to work on that throttling system for Spectre. Oh, not this again. I'm not even sure how it happened this time. so I'm gonna just pray that it was a fluke and doesn't happen again. With the exploding problem solved by just making it slow down a bit when it's heading towards the shattered planet, my new issue is that it just cannot collect enough Promethium chunks. The new design I came up with looked like this. It's got more collectors, more railguns, more rockets and more gun turrets. Better in every conceivable way. Testing it out in deep space, you can see it doesn't even blink at the onslaught of asteroids. I do still think I can push it a bit further though. As it turns out, if you go far enough back behind a thruster, you are eventually able to build again, and I can use this to add a second stack of thrusters behind the first ones. With this adjustment, it can now hit around 600 km a second whilst inside the star system, which increases the number of eggs it can carry, since it can gather more Promethium before they spoil, which is effectively our biggest limiter at the moment. Meanwhile on Nalvis, the Shadow government has legalised nuclear bombs, so I start upcycling them to get legendary uranium-235 for legendary biolabs. As it turns out, that actually needs a lot of uranium, who'd have thunk it, so it's time to design a new high throughput uranium processing setup. It'll probably take a while for all the centrifuges to get sent over, because I wasn't anticipating ever needing more, and so haven't been making them since I initially set up Nalvis. I'm just brute forcing Corvarex again, since this thing is so high throughput, it won't even take that long for all the buffers to fill. Whilst it does, I set up CaptureBot upcycling, and since we can craft legendary labs easily from our legendary items on Vulcanus, and we already set up legendary reinforced concrete, the only thing separating us from legendary biolabs is time. It's worth noting we're still only getting uranium from this piddly little patch I set up 100 hours ago, so I'm doing something I've never done before and beaconing my miners. To save me importing robot frames from Vulcanus to make the capture bots, I put this little spaghetti build together near my circuit builds. Then, in an effort to improve the throughput of the new Corvarex build, I wanted to use stack inserters to output from the machines. But since most only have enough room for one stack inserter, and Corvarex has two outputs, this would very quickly deadlock as the stack inserter gets stuck trying to pick up one, whilst the other backs up. To fix this, I have this little circuit which usually keeps the stack size of the inserters at their default of 16, but every second or so changes it to 1, which forces all the inserters to drop what's in their hand, preventing deadlocks. It does technically decrease throughput as some inserters will drop partial stacks, but it's a massive improvement over using bulk inserters either way. I liked that first Corvarex setup so much, I made another one. I don't think we're going to have any uranium-235 problems anytime soon. Also whilst I'm here, I built this expandable egg launching setup to supply Promethium science. It's more in the vein of the first setups I built, but is far more easily expandable and slightly higher throughput. By now, I've pushed Spectre to carry 25,000 eggs out to the shattered planet, which it can turn into over 60,000 Promethium science pack. This is about the limit for this platform, as the last few hundred eggs spoil, which the Tesla turrets handle alright, but means that if any more delays occur, the consequences could be deadly. On Nalvis, the first few legendary biolabs have crafted, so I can place them down to boost our already immense science consumption. On Vulcanus, I've built a new generation of legendary blue circuit production, which is basically the same as the other two, but it's impossible to back up and easily tileable. I'm going to make a controversial decision now, for the sake of UPS going forward. Since nuclear bombs are literally a dime a dozen at this point, biters no longer pose any threat besides to my performance. For this reason, I've decided to turn off biters in the map generation settings. The existing biters will remain, so we'll still have to kill them off, but it means that any newly generated terrain will no longer spawn them. And once I've put the work in and extinctionated them, then I'll be saving some UPS, which we're going to need for the final base. I have one final little redesign for Spectre, whereby installing these recessed asteroid collectors allows us to get more of the Promethium chunks we were losing to the nose of the platform, without having to sacrifice any railguns. I've now finally found a use for Thunderball. as a carbon copy of Spectre. This design, on average, produces between 1800 and 2000 Prometheum science packs per minute, meaning that with 2 of them, that puts our Prometheum production on par with the production of all the other sciences, a feat I'm unlikely to be able to replicate for the final Megabase. Watching these mega platforms in deep space, their serpentine arms splayed out like some sort of eldritch horror, is one of the most satisfying experiences Factorio has to offer. They exist on a knife's edge, however. I have to set up recycling for any excess Prometheum science because any backup would cause thousands of eggs to hatch on the platform, which would easily destroy it. So, as we close in on the end here, it's about time to reveal what the final eSPM for this episode is. From 3600 packs per minute, passed through biolabs with research productivity level 40 and legendary productivity 3 modules, we're coming out to a whopping 40,000 eSPM, which we'll call 36,000 to account for those little dips you can see on the graph. Between that, my sustainable production of just about every legendary building and module I'm ever going to want, and my newly upgraded PC, I think we're just about ready to take on the true final challenge. Next time. You've watched me build up my empire of steel from nothing. You've seen me cross the star system in search of technology, from the forge world of Vulcanus to the inhospitable oceans of Aquilo. And you've watched as I perfected my craft to produce only the most legendary of items. And now, the chickens have come home to roost. After 2 episodes and more than 5 real-life days of playtime, we're ready to cross the 1,000,000 threshold and build the Megabase. We begin by coming full circle, setting up red science on Vulcanus, just like we did 120 odd hours ago. Unfortunately, a few demolishers mistakenly believed they owned the land I wanted to build on, so I gave them a gentle reminder with my railgun. Although building it on Vulcanus means we'll have to ship quite a few sciences over to Nalvis via space platform, the unlimited iron, copper and stone, and the convenience that brings, make Vulcanus the obvious choice. Red science being red science, it's incredibly simple, and I'm able to direct insert the copper plates and iron gears directly from foundry to machine by using this alternating pattern. I make this little module, which as you can see has a comedically high ratio of rocket silo to science pack assembler. It might seem silly, but the space platform is only overhead for a very, very small proportion of the time, so the high launching rate allows us to fill the platform quickly so it can continue its journey. After a lot of pondering, I finally conclude that there's not a chance in hell I can route the pipes into this thing, so I have to move the wings out a bit and use double legendary long inserters instead of the bulk ones, after which the pipes fit comfortably. Once I've added a few belts to feed rocket ingredients into the silos, all that's left to do is copy it many, many times. To reach 1,000,000 eSPM, assuming a research productivity level of 60, which I judge to be reasonable to reach, we need to craft 62,500 packs per minute, which for convenience and to account for any minor mistakes I will probably make, I've rounded that up to 5 fully stacked green belts, which is 72,000 packs a minute. That's going to take a pretty long time to build, considering all the legendary buildings and modules it requires, so I move on to belting over rocket ingredients in the meantime. Given the size and cost of these builds, it's not very often I'm still doing nothing when they finish construction, so the half-finished overviews will have to suffice until the very end. Sure enough, whilst it's still missing a few rocket silos and a lot of modules, I've already moved on to designing green science. This won't be quite as easy, since I can't just craft the ingredients from fluids right on each building's doorstep. There is a balance to be struck with builds like these between size, practicality, and complexity. In an ideal world I would build each science in a single big long stack, but belt throughput limits mean that's not quite practical. For instance, here with green science, I could have maybe just built 2 stacks, but I would have then had to find a way to cram 2 more belts through this space cleanly, So to save my brain this early into the project, I just broke the whole thing into 4 stacks, as you'll soon see. Once I have something I'm happy with, for the most part, I copy that up as many times as its belt throughput will allow for, and then copy that out to the side to reach the required number of stacks for our SPM targets. Unfortunately, that's not as done there, as I still need to make the iron, gears and circuits that will feed the machines. I'll also break this up into stacks, so I can just make the right amount for each stack and then copy that over for each one. I immediately moved on to designing blue science. It would be very easy to get intimidated and flounder at the thought of all the work ahead, but at this point my mindset was to just keep putting one foot in front of the other, just keep doing the next thing, until I'd made enough progress that I'd spent too much time already to give up. I thought a lot about how I could incorporate some direct insertion into blue science like I did with the prior two, but in the end decided that it would be easier to craft all the ingredients externally and feed them in like the plates, gears and circuits from green science. Despite the frankly ridiculous amount of beacons I used for the science assemblers, the long crafting time of blue science makes this build quite girthy? I start off with engine units, which are quite easy considering they can be made entirely out of molten iron, a property the other ingredients don't share. Red circuits are up next, and whilst I would have loved to share the 4 beacons in the middle there to save some resources, my green belts don't quite bridge the gap. Ignore the fact I could have easily just left a gap between the EM plant and the beacons to put the undergrounds there. I've only just realised that right now. The final ingredient is of course sulphur, which I bundle up next to the plastic for the circuits. We're going to need oil to make the plastic and circuits, as well as for the other sciences down the line, so I get a big coal liquefaction plant set up. I hate trying to ratio with oil products, so I had no idea if this was a sufficient amount, and still don't because I'm writing this script right now to procrastinate working on cryogenic science, so I've not stress tested all the factories yet. A fact that hindsight has gifted me, however, is that putting all those speed modules in the cryo plants was pretty much useless, as it's heavily bottlenecked on the 6,000 units a second limit on each fluid output. My prior conceptions about Fluids 2.0 make it very weird to me that the number of fluid outputs connected from a machine actually increases its throughput, even if it absolutely makes sense. Once I've belted in some coal and primed the system using the shitty heavy oil recipe, the build spins to life. Of course, it pretty much immediately stopped since we're not actually balancing or using any of the oil products yet, so I set up oil cracking too. It might not look that big, but between the legendary chemical plants, beacons and speed modules, it's got easily more than 10 times the throughput of an equivalently sized common build. Upon connecting the petroleum, coal and water to the blue science ingredient stack, it springs to life, and we can see if it works. Yep, it's certainly producing things. I've got no idea if my calculations were right and that's enough production, because we're about 4 hours of module production away from it being finished, so I guess I'll just move on and find out later. Time to copy this untested production module 4 times. I'm an engineer. Something interesting pointed out to me by a commenter is that putting speed modules in quality production isn't the stupidest idea ever. Even though legendary speed modules confer more of a speed bonus, they don't actually give any extra quality debuff over their common counterparts, so you can actually get an appreciable amount more quality production per minute for the cost of a slightly higher material cost. Next up, I redistributed the cargo bays on Nalvis, so that I can start figuring out how I'm going to get 55 belts of science out of this landing pad. The answer is dragging and screaming. I'll tell you one thing, it's not happening via inserter, so I get to work smothering the pad with roboports. Theoretically, robot throughput is soft capped at some ridiculous number, but in practice it's limited by how much of your base you're willing to turn into roboports. I'll feed all the sciences into these requester chests, which then dump immediately onto belts, half a belt of science each. I'll then only need 10 of these to pull out all the science I'm going to need, but getting it onto the belt is easy, getting it off is the hard part. I even took the time to turn it into a rainbow for your viewing pleasure. I took a moment to wonder how you get 6 belts of input into this, and then I realised you don't, and accepted I'll have to take a hit on the total beacon number and up my legendary lab production at some point. Yes, that's 7 belts of input. I said I was good at Factorio. I never said I could count. I realised my mistake as I'm connecting the Rainbow Road up to the stack. So, how many legendary labs surrounded by legendary beacons full of legendary speed modules will I need for half a belt of science? 6? A dozen? 30? All I knew at this point was that I'd used up every single legendary lab I'd ever crafted and still not exhausted a single of the 10 half belts I'd need to consume by the end of this. Time to kick that can down the road. I would probably say that the beginning of designing purple science was the moment where the brain damage imparted by this run really began. Building science setups is fun. Doing a bit of logistical routing is fun. Building big, complicated modules you're trying to keep small for aesthetic reasons, but not too small for exhibitionary reasons, which don't finish constructing for hours, so you can't really test on the fly and might end up needing to be entirely reconstructed later if you made a mistake because of a previously mentioned compactness, is not fun. It hurts. But it'll be worth it when I can sit back and look at that 7-digit eSPM number. I pulled direct insertion back out for Rails for crafting purple science, but I honestly don't even know why, as it uses more belts to send Rails down completed than to send the ingredients down and craft on site, as a full belt of stone, steel and iron sticks turns into 2 belts of Rails. Because of the pure throughput of rail ingredients required, I'm going to have to split this one into a whopping 16 stacks. Each of these 8 stacks here actually being 2 stacks facing into each other. It almost certainly would have been easier to feed Rails in crafted and find a way to get a 4th belt in to make 8 big stacks, but I've made my choice now. Next up, I started on the external production module for Rails, which is quite convenient because we get stone as a byproduct from making molten iron for the steel and iron sticks. An intelligent approach for this would be calculating whether we make excess stone or excess molten iron, so I can figure out if I need to be pumping extra iron in or excess iron out. But my idea was to just build the thing, let it run, and then figure that out the hard way. I hedged my bets early that I was going to need to pull iron out of the system, but the pumps can be easily reversed if I'm wrong. I move on to the electric furnace and productivity module production in the meantime, and I'm again using the stone from producing molten copper to make bricks for electric furnaces. I'm so sure that I'll have too much molten copper that I not only add an outflow like for the iron, but also a dedicated copper voider for if that isn't enough. I cram the red and green circuits in next, and since I'm making red circuits that needs plastic. Here's what I end up with for the production module. A big mess. It's only then that I realised that I didn't leave a space to run the rocket ingredients to the silos. And after I started figuring that out, I realised I also hadn't routed the productivity modules and electric furnaces into the science assemblers. Buffoon. The absolute mess I've caused here by not leaving enough space is incomprehensible. They used to hit people with hammers for making monsters like this. Anyway, with no further questions asked, time to copy it a load of times. Unlike the other 2 science builds, it needs copying to the top 2, since as I mentioned earlier, each stack is actually 2 stacks facing into each other. Once I've copied them all down, you can see that this is going to be quite an immense build. Talking about immense, here's an update in the lab setup department. That might just about be enough for 1/10 of our total requirements. I'm going to need to actually move some of this science at some point, so welcome Mango Loco into the world. Yep, we're naming them after monster flavours this time. Although this galaxy shape might be pretty cool, the thought of trying to fit all of the engines and make it work is making my brain melt. So instead, it's getting shaped like a monster can. After sneaking a little nuclear reactor in under the hub, I can put down some grabby arms so we can produce fuel. You're probably wondering how I'm planning to get ammo to the front of the ship through all those cargo bays. I don't. It's gonna look like a rave up here. Once I've set up the asteroid crushing and fuel production, I can get her loaded up with red science. I'm requesting 360,000 red science packs, which is 5 minutes worth of production. So as long as it can complete a round trip in less than 5 minutes, then it'll be able to cope with demand. That does however mean we're going to have one Mango Loco for every single science pack, except for cryogenic, which will need a ship that can handle the outer system, and space science, which will make alternative arrangements for. Anyway, it took me precisely 0.95 trips to figure out that this number of laser turrets won't be sufficient. However, that's as many as our nuclear power plant can support. What to do? The correct answer was probably to scrap the lasers, make some ammo production, and have it done with. My answer? Legendary nuclear reactors. 2.5 times more power means 2.5 times more laser turrets. It now has little issue with asteroids, so I copied down 3 more of the same platform for green, blue, and purple science. With red, green, blue and purple science complete, we could now theoretically research mining or steel productivity at 1 million eSPM. However, as I mentioned before, we only have a tenth the number of labs we would need to consume that amount of science. Let's make that a fifth. When I built purple science earlier, and I was pondering whether it takes more iron in or spits more out, it turns out that it landed firmly on the side of out. So much so, in fact, that I had to set up this big iron voiding setup, because the other sciences weren't using up the iron enough, and we were beginning to run low on stone for the rails. There is no rest for the wicked, so immediately I get to work on military science. Yes, we are actually automating that. When building it, I didn't put beacons between the pairs of assemblers like I have with every other science. This causes an issue which I want you to try to figure out before it manifests, because it comes back around later too. Whilst you think about that, it's time to turn that fifth of the necessary labs into 2/5. Eventually, anyway, it might take a while to build. I've also started using common biolabs and only upgrading them to legendary as they craft, so that we can still do some research, even if it's a bit slow. I then realised that my power fucking died. Ruh-roh. Turns out that when I demolished that little iron production I set up when I first landed here, I hadn't considered what it was providing for. Namely, fission cells for the reactors. I set up a provider chest pulling from a random iron plate foundry so that this won't happen again, and then tried to kick the reactors back to life with some handcrafted cells. Back at military science, I'm starting off with walls because it needs a truly silly amount of stone. For legendaries, this is a lot of buildings, but we actually need to double it. On today's game of Spot the Problem, here's my stone production from molten copper. Red ammo and grenades come together quite easily, despite some belt shenanigans to get iron and coal into the grenade assemblers. Funnily enough, the inability to productivity module any direct ingredient actually makes military one of the more annoying sciences to build. In regards to the molten copper, if you spotted that I hadn't made any way to actually get the molten copper out of the machine, you're smarter than me. I end up with this, which, although slightly less elegant, wasn't too much of a change from what I had originally. Rather than deal with the molten copper internally, like would have been the intelligent choice, I ended up just making an expandable external void, which they could all connect up to. There's nothing wrong with it, in theory, but it could have easily fit into each stack individually. After setting up a little molten iron setup to feed it, I then need, and this is a technical term, a metric fuckton of coal. Since I finished the builds for the first 4 sciences, my mining productivity research has absolutely took off, and so I'm able to fill a fully stacked green belt with no more than 4 big mining drills. Keep in mind that quality has no effect on mining speed. Your eyes do not deceive you, that's 16 stacked green belts of coal, the equivalent of 86 unstacked blue belts if your brain still runs on pre-space age metrics like mine does. For now, I connect the first 3 up to the stack we've built to make sure it works before I build the rest. A quick glance at the minimap will reveal how dire the module situation is. Every flashing yellow symbol is a machine missing at least one module. I think I've given you enough time to figure it out. It was probably pretty obvious. But the problem with the military science production is that I never left any room to insert rocket ingredients into the silos. I toy around with using requester chests to insert the ingredients, but in the end just deconstruct the whole thing and reconstruct it with gaps in between the stacks to run belts. That'll give the construction bots something to chew on. The great but slightly annoying thing about rocket silos is that if they've got productivity modules and are affected by any more than like 1 legendary speed beacon, you know they're launching as fast as they possibly can due to the animation cap. I sometimes find myself wishing higher quality silos could launch rockets faster, which might have assuaged some of my later mistakes. I'm happy enough that the module is working so I can copy it and hook up the rest of the coal belts. You might think that all this coal mining would dry out that patch pretty quickly, but between the 16% resource depletion from legendary big drills and my hundreds of levels of mining productivity, the patch will last hundreds of times longer than usual. I was hoping that would be military science done, sans modules, but my external copper sink has come back around to bite me, and I had to double its size for the 4th or 5th time. Making a surprise return after last being seen in my Nullius series, I downloaded the Auto Research mod so that I could queue mining productivity automatically instead of needing to fill the queue with it every 15 minutes. The decision to make mining productivity costs scale linearly makes sense, but it's also funny how ridiculously high we can get the number due to that. I've gathered up enough inertia from finishing military science now and can go straight into yellow science. Conventionally, yellow science is considered the hardest pre-space science, but as you'll see, it's going to practically fall together. LDS is pretty simple, just taking 3 fluids and some coal to make the plastic, and I've made blue circuits a million times at this point, so that was never going to be an issue. It does take a lot of copper though. Good job military science produces so much that it's an actual problem. Fun fact from a bit later on, if yellow science isn't running, military still doesn't get rid of enough copper to hit full pelt, although that's not really an issue, because there isn't any infinite researchers that take military science but not yellow. My commitment to keeping the whole build in the same footprint as the science assemblers and rocket silos has led to me using blue belts for what I believe to be the first time in this entire run to commit the sin of belt weaving for the flying robot frame assemblers. It looks pretty slick. I might do it more. Steel is easy with all the molten iron pipes running around. I can nick some green circuits off the blue circuit build, and batteries are pretty easy considering they just require combining 3 fluids. I then realised I need to pull green circuits over for electric engines from somewhere, and wanting to make sure it gets a balanced amount from both belts suddenly turned this into a bit more of an issue. The electric engine production itself is pretty small, but pulling lube all the way from my oil setup to here was quite the odyssey. I realised now that until we're firing on all cylinders, military science won't necessarily be getting produced at the same time as yellow science, leading to vital copper being voided and the yellow science build being starved until military science starts up again. So my solution is a truly ridiculously sized molten copper buffer. It's like one of those things new Factorio players build for light and heavy oil before they discover cracking exists. Anyway, I'm happy enough that it seems semi-functional at this point and can copy it out and set up its Mango Loco. Somehow, it's already time for our final science pack that will be produced on Vulcanus, the Metallurgic Science Pack. He will never forget to add rocket component. Buffoon! The first 2 ingredients, tungsten carbide and tungsten plate, are pretty easy, just made by combining tungsten ore with carbon or molten iron, respectively. The real problem is making enough molten copper, and unfortunately all of military science probably produces about enough to feed a quarter of what we need, so I'll have to figure something else out on site. I got distracted mid-build, however, and noticed that Spectre is just gone. I couldn't find it in any of my autosaves, so it must have happened hours ago, and I just never noticed.
Oh no! Anyway...
To get rid of the stone byproduct from molten copper, I'm just turning it into furnaces and recycling over and over like I did for voiding byproducts of EM science. You might be thinking metallurgic science has been too easy so far, and that's because it has. The real problem is somehow getting 14 belts of tungsten ore over here. My first idea was trains, but at this scale they're very impractical, so I instead go for the old reliable strategy of running a massive fully stacked belt for miles through the boonies. But my expandability, my heckin' wholesome modularity, what happens when the patch runs out? What happens when the patch runs out? I don't intend to still be here when the patches run out. There's belt 1 and 2 of 14, so we can at least make sure it works. Science is definitely crafting, but I feel like something's missing here. If tungsten had the same mining speed as everything else, I probably could have done all 15 belts off 1 or 2 particularly large patches. But alas, here I am connecting tungsten patches from here and there and everywhere to feed the machine. And when I connect up the last one, I feel nothing. By making green belts and belt stacking and neglecting my precious little trains, the devs have corrupted me. I don't feel like I've won anything here. I've gone against everything I swore to when I first delayed Track and Sleeper. This doesn't feel like a victory, it feels like betraying an old friend. Alas, up on Casino Royale, it's about time we expand space science production. This is the setup I have for the actual science, with each craft giving us 5 science packs, 10 after productivity. You actually need very little input materials to make a lot of science. So as you can see, it's split into 5 chunks, so I can pull out the 5 belts in increments. For the inputs, I just have 3 pairs of legendary asteroid collectors hooked up to 3 copies of the chunk sorting I used for my previous space science setup. In terms of processing, this is all we need. I'm not kidding. After that, I do some fuel production and an array of extra thrusters to try to offset the drag and extra weight this has added onto the platform. Down on Nalvies, my legendary lab production has been severely hamstringed by a lack of legendary eggs, so I quadrupled the production, because I can. Having a base this well established is the closest thing I'm ever going to get to the feeling of being truly Musk Bezos Gates level fuck off wealthy. Now that 8 out of 11 sciences are done, which sounds really good in theory, I have no other choice but to take on the big 3, starting with cryoscience. If you think the brain damage got bad with purple science, just you wait. I wrote most of this script procrastinating cryoscience alone. I started off by trying to design a stack from scratch, before realising my previous cryoscience setup was pretty good and just copying some of that. 7200 SPM, which is about 1/10 of what we'll ultimately need, takes about 14 cryo plants, so that's a pretty good number for each stack. Next up we'll need to cool the plants, so I set up twin cooling plants at the end. The cooling process is lossy, so I set up a plant to produce the coolant itself, as well as a machine to turn the ocean water into both ice for the science and ammonia for the coolant and some other purposes. This is easy. And then I go to Nalvis to copy down another lab setup. Why? I don't know, we were doing cryoscience. Coolant requires solid fuel and raw lithium as ingredients, so I've put them next to each other, and the plan is to insert them both into this chest, with circuit controls of course to stop one filling it up all the way, and then insert from that into the coolant plant because it really doesn't need that much of either. I then think for a while. Heat pipe make me brain melty. The final direct ingredient of cryoscience is smelted lithium, so I can set up a few furnaces for that down here next. I get that connected up with the ice to a belt running down to the science assemblers, and I must be basically done now, right? Well, my stupid ass got distracted again looking at metallurgic science because I wondered why it was bottlenecking my artillery range research. Yeah, I never got around to extincting the biters. Sue me. But anyway, I look at the silos and as we already know, no fucking rocket ingredients. I'm not cut pasting it all out like I did with military science, so the quester chests will have to suffice. Anyway, it's move making time back on Aquilo, as I connect this science stack up to the rocket fuel belt so it can heat itself. I forgot to add inline robo parts, so I'm placing them on either side for each stack, which has the double effect of giving me a little bit of leeway with the footprint I decided on for the build, which I will use. You probably noticed that unlike every other science build so far, besides space, but that doesn't count, I'm not directly inserting science into the rocket silos. This was a calamitous lapse in judgment. Let's do some maths. Assuming there's always another rocket ready in the silo when the prior one launches, then a rocket silo can launch a rocket about once every 27 seconds. Let's call it 30 for simplicity. Each rocket holds 1,000 science packs, and if a rocket launches every 30 seconds, then that means we can launch 2,000 packs per minute per silo. Considering this is a 7,200 packs per minute stack, and that is 2 rocket silos, aka 4,000 packs per minute, we're gonna have to do some redesigning. Time to spend 45 minutes staring at fucking nothing to ponder this. On the bright side, we can watch the science stack warm up, which is kind of satisfying. My idea was to just use inserters and pass through from the 2 rocket silos to 2 more rocket silos. I still can't make any snarky comments on the eventual effectiveness of this because I'm still procrastinating finishing this build as I write this. Professional YouTuber here. The only thing that's seemingly missing now is a way to void all of the excess ammonia, for which you should not be surprised I'm employing the cheesy fluid deletion mechanic I've used basically everywhere else. Before I even finished it, and it's by no means a complicated system, my excitement got the better of me because finally, after nearly 50 hours into building this Megabase, I have a use case for trains. The fluid requirements for this build are surprisingly small, coming out to something like a train every 15 minutes for lithium brine, and even less for fluorine. Crude oil I won't even train in. I can use the same supply I've always been using from the main island. I already had the knack for building Aquilo train stations locked down when I first came here, so setting that bit up was probably the easiest part of this whole build. You can see at the bottom there, I realised I didn't really have a good place to put the ammonia ocean pumps, so I'm making use of that footprint leeway I gave myself to put them slightly outside of the build. I'll just have to make sure I don't put something on the top in the same place. Because of the low fluid throughput requirements, my plan is to just have one train for each fluid take care of each stack, so this train stacker was kind of pointless. I then realised that this lithium cryo plant was meant to have beacons, so it's a good job I left some space on the top and bottom. It does however interfere with the offshore pumps, believe it or not, so I'll have to move them a bit, won't I? After setting up a lithium brine outpost up here, I actually measured how big the science stack would be and realised it was in the way, so time to tear it down again and move it up here. With that lithium brine trained in, the lithium cryo plant correctly beaconed, and the ammonia sink finished, all that's left now is fluorine, and crude oil, but that's still coming from the starter patch. Once that's connected up, it all starts up at once, and we have 9 sciences out of 11 producing, but not quite done. We need 9 more of these stacks first. Speaking of which, let's get that second one copied down. The tiny fluorine outpost wasn't going to do much, so I spread it out to cover the whole patch. Funnily enough, at over 700 levels of mining productivity, this is probably enough for the full build. Anyway, after setting up a new rocket fuel build since the old one was struggling, and after struggling to make a larger fusion reactor setup on this planet, so instead copying down a load of little ones, I'll skip over the hours of waiting for the slow-ass Aquilo construction bots to build all the science to the bit when it's done, besides for a few rocket silos anyway. We can now say that 9 out of 11 sciences are complete. The mere thought of even looking at Fulgora is making me queasy after the last time we were there, so my next planet is everyone's favourite, Gleba. I'm not joking, because it is my favourite, and if it's not yours, you're a coward. I found a good area far out west with a good amount of nearby green and purple biome and get down to designing this thing, starting with the science pack production itself. As you can see, I'm planning for a very strict footprint here, because I want it to look cool. Anything to stay sane at this point. Pentapod eggs are next, and they take so much nutrients I decided to direct insert it and belt in bioflux. These things have a way of starting off simple and very quickly snowballing into a massive mess, as I need to figure out how I'm going to get nutrients in and spoilage out of literally everything. The design I end out with isn't quite as nice as the one I had in my head, but we move on. Believe it or not, this one biochamber is enough to produce the nutrients to fuel the entire stack, even with every biochamber having prod-free modules and being affected by at least 3 speed-free beacons. And that's with me counting the pentapod egg assemblers, the fuel part obviously. But they don't need these nutrients because they already get fed by the biochambers that make their ingredient nutrients. Next up is bioflux, which also needs shockingly few machines. You've caught me here mid-conniption about how I'm going to route all of the nutrients into it and spoilage out. In the end I had to start the shared nutrient and spoilage belt backwards, with spoilage on the outside and nutrients on the inside, and then flip it back later with a filtered splitter to make this fit in the tiny space. Here's the fruit processing and aforementioned splitter. We need just north of a belt of Umicore and a bit more than half a belt of jelly nut to get the 86,400 packs per minute of agri-science we want here, so that's why there's 3 belts running through the middle. You did hear me right, 86,400 packs per minute, as since agri-science rots and that reduces its research capabilities, we need to leave a bit more headroom to make sure it can keep up. Before we get to the rocket silos, I add these recyclers to destroy any pentapod eggs or bioflux that reach the end of the belt so they don't back up and spoil. The footprint of the build itself is just exactly big enough to fit a silo, so the science and rocket ingredients must be underground belted through them. I'm also bringing in rocket ingredients by request a chest, because I have more than 25,000 logistics bots on this planet, and more rocket part productivity than I know what to do with. This is, I think self-evidently, massive overkill in the silo department. I don't know why I did it. To supply my Umicore needs, I need 280 farming space per one of these stacks, which is the equivalent of like 6 agricultural towers with all available spaces arable. That means for the full build we need 36 agricultural towers farming Umicore. More, since there will be some areas of non-green biome in some of those towers. I'm getting seeds to the towers by way of, again, logistics bots because, again, I have 27,000 of them. At any given point we either have too much Umicore or too little, and since spoilage makes buffering not an option, I put these heating towers at the very end of the belt to destroy any excess. The process for jelly nut is literally the same, except it graciously requires like half as many agricultural towers. I'm not building all the stacks now because we'll still be waiting a while on overgrowth soil, but this boosted production will actually make our overgrowth soil production faster, as it's limited by the number of seeds we have. Soon enough we have a little trickle of both fruits and can put some nutrients into the machines to get the loop going. After looking at it for about 0.7 seconds, I quickly realised I forgot to beacon the Umicore processing, but that's quite easily fixed. It boots up slowly and then all at once. With a few kidnapped eggs from the old science build, we can see it raw to life faultlessly, a kind of lull before the storm that is Fulgora. Unlike previous planets, I'm not finishing it right now. Like I said, the overgrowth soil won't be ready for a few hours, so I'll be remotely copying a new stack every now and again, until it reaches full capacity. It will get its time in the limelight later in the video, however, as it's easily one of my favourite things I build in this entire project. After that relatively pleasant experience, it's time to descend into hell. I'm not kidding, megabasing Fulgora makes every other planet look like a stroll through the daisies. This place is trash, and it wants to remain that way. This will not prevent me from trying. The first thing I do is find a scrap island, which of course will be the very core of the base. My first idea is to mine directly into a rocket silo and feed that into recyclers. Since my mining productivity level is so high, each drill produces more than even a well-beaconed legendary recycler can process. I beaconed the absolute shart out of it before realising you can't insert blue circuits and LDS into rocket silos, as they will only ever be treated as rocket components and won't go into storage. So I'm keeping the rocket silo idea, but I'm including belts which can pull blue circuits and LDS out without needing them to pass through the rocket silo. Batteries are almost always the limiting factor on purely EM science builds, so my next step is to work through all the scrap products and find ways to destroy overflow of everything else. Concrete gets turned into hazard concrete and then gets recycled back into concrete on a loop, same with steel into steel chests. Ice and solid fuel can just get recycled in a little loop, and gears get recycled into iron and then crafted back into gears. The shapes and sizes of all these little bits will change a lot over the course of this build, so I encourage you to look at the overall structure rather than the finer details. I do start some actual production here, turning ice into water and combining that with stone and holmium ore to make holmium solution and then plates. The plastic from recycling red circuits is needed for making superconductor, and the copper can be used to make batteries to help make up the shortfall. I encourage you to enjoy the petrochemical knot I tied myself into trying to make batteries in this thing. I certainly didn't. Electrolyte comes next along with some rocket fuel, since the solid fuel was already coming this way with the ice belt. Then it's supercapacitors and accumulators, the two solid ingredients of EM science. Combining those two together along with electrolyte and holmium solution gets us our precious EM science. The target for each of these setups is 7200 packs per minute, and with 2 fitting on each patch we'll have to cover only 5 patches to get 72,000 packs per minute. Probably the hardest thing to scrap are LDS and blue circuits, and I tried just doing a dumb block like this, but it very quickly backed up. A slightly more intelligent interpretation for blue circuits might look like this, which properly separates out the products so they cannot back up. It's also stealing the plastic out to feed the main build, since we have a chronic shortage for superconductor. LDS is a bit easier after that, especially since we want the copper and plastic for batteries and the previously mentioned superconductor respectively. I get around to cleaning up some of the rough edges left, such as a green circuit voider for if they back up, since we produce ever so slightly too many from scrapping red circuits. I copy and flip it to give us what will eventually be a 14,400 packs per minute module, once we've ironed out the rest of the kinks. It's easily the biggest and ugliest of the science builds we've made. I have to have a bit of a shuffle around to get some more beacons in and meet production demands, but after that, all we're waiting for is a few more scrap productivity researches to finish for it to hit its peak. I get a second one copied down, but just like Glaber, it's going to be a waiting game, this time for some more foundation to be delivered. We have most of it just from it accumulating over the last few dozen hours, but it's being delivered by Citroen DS3, so it's not coming fast and there's still a bit more we'll be waiting on to produce. It's with no regret whatsoever that I inform you I do not intend to take Prometheum science to 1 million eSPM. That's a task not well suited for even the best computer, and after taking a month-long sabbatical from the run due to burnout, I'm not putting myself out for another month just to watch a PowerPoint of a space platform. I'm still going to do something interesting though, don't worry. I intend to speedrun to the Shattered Planet. The first bit to plan is of course the weaponry. We're going to need a lot of it, but maybe not as much as you think. Once the front row is filled with railgun turrets, adding any more width to the build just exposes you to more asteroids, so the ship needs to just be wide enough to fit this massive fusion reactor on it. Again, maybe not as big as you think it should be, because legendary quality means our power demand won't be as astronomical as our ammo production. Next up is probably far too many asteroid collectors, but you can never be too careful. I won't inundate you with the details of its design. God knows I've made enough space platforms this run, but here's a quick overview. A detail which is worth noting is that I'm not just double layering, but triple layering the thrusters. To get to the Shattered Planet in less than 2 hours, which is my goal, I need to average at least 555 km per second, but my hope is that if I can go way faster early on, I can afford to slow down later when the asteroid barrage is at its worst. Whilst I slowly grow my farming operation on Glaber, it's time for me to send out the platform, which I've named Ultra after my wife's favourite flavour of monster. Here we can see it in action, cruising at 750 km per second, way past the star system's edge. You might notice the backwards facing railguns on the sides there, and like me you might have never even seen the front of a railgun until now, but those are there to snipe any huge asteroids that come a bit too close and might hit one of my trailing thruster stacks. I don't have to worry about them hitting the ship itself however, because that would require an asteroid to be inside it, and if that were the case, then that's already game over. I think I realised at this point it's probably going to need some spare parts, because I increased the production buffer of railgun turrets on Aquilo a decent amount. It probably would have been best to use higher quality and particularly legendary railgun turrets for the extra range, but I never set up legendary quantum circuit production, and I certainly don't plan to do it now. It actually seems to be going alright until I leave it running for a bit and come back to this. This is pure speculation because I wasn't actively watching, but I'm 90% sure this has something to do with the backwards facing railguns. I turn it around to head back to Vulcanus for some servicing, resupplying and a redesign. In my infinite wisdom, I decided the answer was just more backwards facing railgun turrets, but thankfully I quickly realised that's a fucking stupid idea and removed them. By the time it reaches 1.5 million kilometres of the way out to the shattered planet, it's still holding up pretty strong. It gets the occasional inconsequential hit on a railgun, but even if one is destroyed there's 40 spares in the cargo, enough to lose one every 100,000 kilometres, as well as 10,000 repair packs. After a glancing blow from an asteroid, I disconnected some fuel plants to slow the ship down slightly, but still above the average required speed of 555 km per second. At this point we're 36 minutes in. By 2.5 million kilometres I've slowed down to 489 km per second, below the average speed we need, but since we were going 200 km per second over that at the start of the journey, I'm not too worried yet. What I am worried for is YouTube's compression algorithm. For that, this is some sort of cruel and esoteric form of torture. It's also cruel and torturous for my poor CPU, so to increase UPS I spend most of the time not actually looking at the platform, instead just zoomed in on the floor and Glebber. But what's this? Something's getting shredded. Somewhere. Oh shit. We can only hope it made it first. When I did get back and load an autosave, the results are still inconclusive. But yes, pretty soon it's clear it's going to make it. It probably got destroyed because I never programmed it to come back, and it will have sat here getting assaulted on all sides by huge asteroids. So how long did it take? I wasn't actually looking at it the moment it crossed the solar system edge, but going off the distance and speed before we first slowed it down, we can work backwards and see it took off at approximately the 205 hours and 25 minute mark. And given that we're now at 207 hours and 17 minutes, that gives us a time of 1 hour and 52 minutes. Not bad at all. Over on Fulgora my 5 science setups have finished, but I was terrified to find them all backed up on batteries. I tried this little circuit thing to only add the crafted ones when we're low on the ones from scrap, but neglected to realise the only reason it was backed up was because the science packs are backed up. Idiot. The science conglomerate on Vulcanus needed a bit more molten iron, so I sorted that out, and then I discovered that green science only just has enough silos to keep up with the 72,000 packs a minute, so it needs a second space platform to move it all. Here we can see though that we can hold LDS productivity research solid, so that's red, green, blue, purple and metallurgic science pack ticked off. Same with blue circuit productivity, so that's EM science ticked off. Rocket damage would tick off everything but cryo science, but we're still not quite farming enough to keep that consistent, so we check cryo science for now, and that looks good. And after some manually messing with request amounts of the 2 agri-science platforms, and adding a few more agricultural towers, we get that to average around 1 million eSPM, although it never quite stays flat thanks to the randomness spoilage introduces. As I give you a brief overview of the base, I'd like to give my thoughts on this series, which has taken a decent portion of the last 4 months of free time in my life. For a start, I'm not a Megabaser. I'll never be a Megabaser. This was torture. Give me my overhaul mods back. I think that was reflected well in the upload schedule for this series, but despite this being one of my least enjoyable videos to make, I'm proud of what I came out with, and I think the result looks pretty good. Funnily enough, my opinions from my original Space Age series haven't really changed too much. Glebber is still my favourite. I still think Vulcanus is far too easy, there's a reason I put all my science there, but this time I'd probably put Fulgora below Aquilo. I got a decent amount of enjoyment from designing that Aquilo build, but my every waking moment on Fulgora was torture. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend megabasing in Space Age purely for the fact you'll have to scale Fulgora at some point. I do hate to keep it brief, but I'm looking forward to moving on to some more hopefully interesting projects. So as always, I'd like to thank my Ko-Fi supporters for supporting me in what I do. Their names are on screen now, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.